They probably have them as cows.
No, I'm pretty sure. But I got
What's good?
Amazon. Did you buy the ones that I got before?
Yeah, salt.
The real ones.
there's real.
Oh yeah.
I got those
Some of
plastic
it's nice.
ones, unfortunately, in the 10 pack.
The last is that.
It is hard. But then when we
But
talk
this is
about
there.
Christians malls also and use like
One of
all
them got
these
a little
really
bit.
like
The one I
far
gave
from
to
me
me.
and shine.
Oh,
Yeah,
Yeah,
we're fine. But then you see post like
this is the preacher.
yeah, but this is a preacher. Okay, well, good morning, everyone. It's our first preschool in 2024. And today we're going to talk about the ideological history of the modern world and the crisis of American empire. And then I think later Doc will read a draft of the vision statement for the year of James Arthur Baldwin. So I think you'll start us off. I'm going to pass it to my worthy colleague, Tony Tara, to begin the discussion.
Okay, thank you very much, Emily Dong of the Massachusetts Dong
Yeah.
and the Beijing Dong. But I just want to build upon something we began a couple of weeks ago when we talked about the rise of Protestantism and that period in the 1500s, 1515 or 17, when Martin Luther arises as the pivotal figure in a struggle against the church and the medieval state, as it were. This is an attempt to frame the intellectual history of the modern world for the purposes of understanding the revolution struggle that we are confronting, and for a way to locate James Baldwin as a revolutionary. I trace the modern world from Martin Luther's 95 demands upon the Catholic Church that he nailed upon the doors of the cathedral in the city where he lived, the name of which I kind of forget right now, claiming that the individual establishes his or her own relationship to God, that the church or the hierarchy that ruled people, that ruled society, did not, could not mediate, I'll put it that way, people's relationship to God. More than anything else, it was a declaration of the sovereignty of the individual. And thus, the individual was an agent of his or her own being, unmediated by the state. I want to underline the word unmediated by the state. Some would say, however, that the period 1350 to 1550 was what could be called pre-modernity, usually associated with the Italian and Dutch Renaissance, the achievements of painting, most notably the depiction of the individual as she or he actually was. This was a great period. And of course, we often associate it with what we call the Dutch masters, or Leonardo da Vinci, or Michelangelo, these great artists who, by the way, painted on the ceilings of churches, but proclaiming a different engagement with the church. So this is often called pre-modernity. It is in this period that we have a new literature, such writers as Shakespeare and Machiavelli, and such. People will say, well, why are you focusing upon Europe as the center of the modern world? And that is a legitimate question. It is a question that Baldwin confronted, that King and others, Du Bois confronted. We'll talk about that in a moment. But then the question, when unanswered or improperly answered, leads to a counter-revolutionary passivity, fitting of a period, the last, let us say, 40 years of the attempt to undo the Third American Revolution and its meanings going forward, which also has witnessed a out-and-out attack upon James Baldwin, which we'll talk about as you know when we read the draft of the vision statement for this year. This period in human history, which is thus centered in Europe, is what we would call an axial age. Axial from the word axis, where the axis of human civilization shifts from the Afro-Asiatic world to Europe. It is an axial age. Now, there were two previous axial ages. The one around 5000 BCE, where we see the rise for the first time of the state, the pharaonic state of Egypt, the dynastic states of India and China, most significantly China, and paralleling in terms of the time period, the Babylonian state. But certainly, if we do, archaeologists have discovered in the same period, that is around 5000 BC, the emergence of the state throughout the world. One might even suggest the Inca and Aztec states, the Congo state in Central Africa, but the Nubian state. But this period around 5000 BCE is perhaps the first great axial age. Some archaeologists and anthropologists would say this is a transition in human development from barbarism to civilization. I want to explain those words because I think each has been totally distorted. Barbarism, quote unquote, is the pre-state form of human development. Okay. In other words, where human beings, for the most part, lived in smaller communities one would even say communes or communistic forms of existence. Nomadism was very developed, and early agriculture. That is what was known as, quote, barbarism. Civilization is, the word itself is connected to civil, which means law-based society. And the great civilizations of this early axial period were again Egypt, some would say call it Kemet, ancient Egypt. The reason 5000 BC is so important is this is when upper, which is the south of Egypt, and lower, which is the north of Egypt, are united into one state. Similar processes, I am not, informed enough to talk about the process and the transition in China. And of course, these state forms, these early state forms lasted millennia. The Chinese dynastic state lasted at least 3,000 years. The ancient Egyptian state lasted longer than everything in history that has come after it. So the early state forms were stabilizing, and endured, not without revolutions, not without struggle. Probably the greatest revolution of ideas in ancient Egypt was that initiated by Akhenaten, who was the first to proclaim monotheism, one God, as opposed to three, and then many others that were derivative from the three gods. And it was from Akhenaten that you get Moses and the Abrahamic religions. Moses was raised in the household of the pharaohs, and he associated with the ideas of Akhenaten. And when Akhenaten is overthrown, the followers of monotheism were cast out. That's where you get the myth of the 12 tribes of Israel. They were cast into the desert, but they were not Jews as such. They were monotheists, followers of the Egyptian pharaoh Akhenaten. You say, but nonetheless, my point is that there were rebellions, there were ideological struggles within these states. However, the long duration of the ancient Egyptian state speaks to its sophistication and I don't know what else, but definitely its sophistication. I don't think we know enough about the ideological history of the Egyptian state and so on. The same thing with China. When you think about the Chinese state, the dynastic state, from about somewhere around 3,300 BCE up to 1911, that's a long duration. Others perhaps didn't last as long, but they became the model of the state. The next axial age was around 600 BCE. And that is where we saw the rise of Buddhism, the rise of Zoroastrianism, the rise of the Greek philosophers and such. But this was an axial age. It was not confined to a particular geography, but it was part of a world movement of ideas, etc. And then the next axial age occurs with the rise of modernity in Europe. And this, as I was saying, I identify this with the 15 teens and Martin Luther. Others would say that early modernity was the Italian and Dutch Renaissances, the revolution in art in particular, and in literature. And by art, I'm talking primarily about painting.
Yeah.
You know? So it was an axial age. And anyone who wishes to go back to a previous axial moment, a previous axis of human civilization in the name of, let us say, Black liberation, are really farcical. It's a farce. History moves forward, and no one can reverse history. And thus, in the name of rejecting Eurocentrism, go back to a axial age where Africa and Asia, Egypt and Babylon, and then India and China were the axis of human civilization. That is an impossibility. Or the claim that to, quote, locate and define the Black person in modern America, we have to go back to our, quote, classical civilization, which is ancient Egypt, in the same way that Europe has its, quote, classical age in Greco-Roman civilization. It is ahistorical. It's without any real scientific foundations, believe me. But I say that only to say that we, all of us, and all of humanity are part of the axial age that we call modernity. But the formation of this axial age, which we know more about than previous ones, occasioned wars, revolutions, and great ideological struggles. This axial age is perhaps more dynamic than any that preceded it. Now, having said that, I do not minimize the agricultural revolution. In fact, the history of Africa, in terms of its languages, in terms of its technology, is grounded in the agricultural revolutions that took humanity from the most simple forms and even from nomadism to settled agriculture, which meant food production became more robust, and with more food production, it was possible to feed more people. Society became healthier, more stable, etc. However, even if one looks at the history of languages on the African continent, and just parenthetically, scholars and researchers who study linguistic groups argue that the foundation of every language in the world are 7 African languages associated with speakers and tribal groups in Southern and Central Africa. That every language in vocabulary, but more in grammar and syntax, can be traced back to 7 African languages. If you're interested, there's a book by a man named John Reader, Reader, entitled Africa, the Biography of a Continent. And the reason I mention it is because he offers a very, very good bibliography of, at that time, this was in the early 2000s, I think, or the late 1990s, the best research up to that time. The other is Bernal's 3 volumes. What's the title?
Black Athena?
Black Athena, yes, Black Athena, especially the 3rd volume, which I find profoundly important to understanding the evolution of linguistic groups in Africa. And, you know, languages are not just, quote, the language we speak, but are divided into major language groups. Major language groups are the boundaries of civilizations. That is why I do not adhere to the Check Ante Diop thesis of two cradles of civilization or one African civilization. Africa consists of 4 distinct civilizations, which are bounded by the 4 major language groupings in Africa. Most who adhere to a Afrocentrist thing associate Africa with phenotype. So, and they, you know, it's a very interesting imagination where the prototypical African in their mind is a West African. But Africa is phenotypically so diverse, perhaps the most diverse part of humanity. You know what I'm saying? Phenotyp. So if you go to East Africa, if you go to Northeast Africa, that's why, you know, a lot of Afrocentrists will claim that the, quote, Arabs appropriated ancient Egypt. Well, first of all, Arabs are a language group falling within that larger group of languages known as Afro-Asiatic languages. So Arabic is not a colonial language in Africa. It is organic to the linguistic history of Northeast Africa, which includes before the Suez Canal, and you know, part of the Afrocentric imagination accepts the British division of Saudi Arabia and the Arabian Peninsula from Africa because of the Suez Canal. So they basically accept a colonial framing of the question of civilization. Saudi Arabia and the nations along the Red Sea are as, quote, black as they get in a lot of ways. But it is linguistically connected to Northeast Africa. The other major group, just to, you know, people talk about the Sudan. The Sudan is divided between North and South and divided between linguistic groups. Now, the Sudan, as we know it, is a colonial boundary. So you can't just say, oh, the Sudan is Arabs in the north, or Muslims in the north, and animists and Christians in the south of Sudan. No, you're talking about two distinct language groupings and two civilizations. The Nilotic people who speak Nilotic languages. And phenotypically, they're very diverse, by the way. But we'll come back to that. But the point I want to make in the evolution of language, civilization, and technology in Africa, what you had was the spread of a linguistic group associated with the Bantu languages. So if you go to West Africa, all of the languages there are part of Bantu languages. Some racist European archaeologists and anthropologists have associated Bantu with inferior. That's, if you take Rwanda, remember the Rwanda Civil War genocide of 1994, 95? Well, the Germans who had colonized that country and others in that area saw one group of people who were tall, aquiline nose, and looked to them more phenotypically European and spoke a Nilotic language, you see, and they associated them with superiority over the shorter, less aquiline, noses, broader lips of Bantu speakers. So you get in Rwanda the Hutu and the Tutsis. Both groups are very interesting, but they are two different language groups emerging from two distinct civilizations. And of course, civilizations are bounded. They speak the same language. They probably eat the same food, and they intermarry. So people take on phenotypic characteristics more similar to each other. That's why, you get a lot of basketball players from Africa, especially from the Sudan, cat's 7'6".
Yeah.
And they all are tall like that. And if you go into Rwanda, among the Tutsis, they don't dance. First of all, they don't play drums the same way as they do in Nigeria. Nigeria is the capital of drumming, but their music is different. Their dance is different. You see, there's a leaping straight up, but that is Tutsi. That is Nilo civilization, Nilo. But I don't want to go further into that. It's a very interesting thing. I could go into the history, what they call the history and geography of human genes. One thing genetically that establishes the oneness of human civilization is to be human is to carry African genes. There's no question about that. Every human population has genes that go back to Africa because that is where the transition from pre-human to what is called anatomically modern human beings begins about 200,000 years ago. And the genetic variation is so fascinating and how science rebuts fiction and farce. But A mitochondrial DNA, a genetic mutation occurs maybe 1 million years ago, but crystallizing about 200,000 years ago in what we call populations, which are no longer apes. They're definitely not Neanderthals. That's people talking, you hear writers, the Neanderthal question. Now, there's no evidence that Neanderthals lived in Africa, but they do live in Europe, or they did live in. Now, they are somewhat modern human and somewhat not, but they died out. They interconnected with anatomically modern human populations. There was interbreeding, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But what happened to the Neanderthals, we don't know. You know? Now, I'm not going to go to the Nation of Islam and the evil science theory, but they ceased to exist. And maybe about 6,000 years ago, the major genetic variation upon the African gene, which evolved for over 100,000 years, is the Asian gene. And that is, if you take big populations, we can see a genetic variation upon the previous African gene. The two major genetic populations in the world are African and Asian.
Mm-hmm.
And here is where science rebuts modern white supremacy. There is no European gene.
Mm-hmm.
European populations are a mixture of African and Asian genes. Overall, if you take European populations, genetically, they are 35% African, 65% Asian. But that's just in the overall sense. There are European populations, for instance, the earliest and most ancient Irish, who were genetically, not phenotypically, because they're white, but genetically, they are closer to West Africans than either population is to South Africans. Which means that these early Europeans populations were Africans who got caught up in the Ice Age. You know what I'm saying? I don't want to get into all of that, but we can take that in any direction. But nonetheless, there are multiple ways of arguing for a single humanity. You can do it linguistically, you can do it genetically, and other ways. But from earliest moments of humanity, our languages have a single source and our genes have a single source, and they are African. But Africa, as we call it today, I'm certain that, if you go back before, the Egyptians did not call themselves African. I don't think anybody called themselves Africans. They were identified with their language, their religion, etc. Okay, but having said all of that, the period of modernity has been at once the most dynamic and one of the most creative moments in human civilizational history, but at the same time, one of the most destructive. Revolution, constantly war, and again, ideological struggle to explain to themselves what was actually happening. You see what I'm saying? That is the ideological framing of the objective material developments. When Martin Luther proclaims the centrality of man as man, he is making a claim against the theist notion that man is but a how would you say, a creation of God, and was in that sense static. That man had little, if no, agency. That's the point I'm trying to make. Man was overdetermined. I'm using man generically, please. I mean, I don't want anybody to misunderstand me. When I say man qua human being, man qua anatomically modern, genetically modern human, that's all I'm saying. If man is not overdetermined by God, if man is not perpetually a servant of something beyond man, then what is man? Man, and thus out of Luther's challenge to the Catholic Church was an ideological challenge. That man was a moral agent, unmediated by the church or the state. Now, we hear this so often, separation of church and state, that man is not a subject or a subject of the state, but that the state is the subject of man. That man is sovereign, not the state. And hence you get, for example, Jean-Jacques Rousseau in the 18th century, the French writer, who says that it is the will of all, you could use the word, the general will, that the state should serve, and not the opposite. That the state had to provide it had an obligation to serve the general will, to serve the people, rather than the other way around. Now, two great political and ideological moments in this new axis of civilization are important to understand. One, as we mentioned, the Protestant Reformation. No small matter. Now, a lot of people will seize upon all of the contradictions, inconsistencies, and failures to realize themselves, that is the Protestant itself, the Protestant Reformation, to reject it, cancel it as it. If it's not perfect, it's not worthwhile. That without, we only because we're perfect, I guess. And anything that is not up to, quote, our level is not worth considering. The Protestant Reformation ultimately realizes itself in the great revolutions of the 18th and early 19th century, the American, French, and Haitian revolutions. However, it was no walk in the park to get from Martin Luther to the Haitian Revolution.
Yeah.
There had to be, and what was, great ideological struggles. And this is what I wish to emphasize, that every revolution in history, in modern history, let me say, are not only preceded by, but are in fact revolutions in the ideological level of humanity. Every revolution is, in the end, a revolution of ideas, a change in the ideological relations between human beings. And that is why anti-revolutionaries in our day and in the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, everyone has always understood that who commands the ideological upper hand controls and directs society. You cannot be a revolutionary without understanding the inevitability of the conflict of ideas. You know, you can't say, well, I'm not interested in physics. That's a European male white thing. You know, well, even if it is just that, does that make it less significant in the struggle for a revolutionary transformation of society? If it is everything bad, then does that make it insignificant? If it is the ideology of a group that controls the state and thus society? And must those ideas, and I would say, put it this way, positive, negative features of it, must they not be constantly assessed and fought against? The Chinese Revolution, Mao and them did not say, oh, we want to go back to the most ancient Chinese dynasty. They said, no, we wish to embrace modernity. That the dynastic organization of Chinese society had prevented our becoming modern. So they embraced, what did they embrace? The American Revolution, the French Revolution. You know, Zhou Enlai famously said, when asked, well, what is your assessment of the French Revolution? He said, well, it's too early to say. We'll see how this thing in China works out. It's so interesting. Ho Chi Minh, in their constitution, cites the American Constitution. Dessalines, Toussaint Louverture in Haiti cite the French Revolution and the rights of man. More than that, the most left wing of the French Revolution, the Jacobins. No revolutionary has tried to go back to a pre-modern period in order to liberate society. Right. They start with modernity. Now, the Protestant Reformation, which as it matures and as those struggles, and I want to talk a little bit about those struggles and wars, as those struggles went forward, crystallized this idea that man is sovereign, the state is not sovereign. And all of these struggles, Protestant Reformation, into the Enlightenment were about the rights of man, the individual, which then broke the nexus of oppression. Because if the ideology that the church and the state ruled over men because the state was connected to God and the Holy Roman Emperor served at the behest, let us say, of the Pope, of the church. The state was an instrument of the church. And the vast peasantry had to exist as subjects of the state. So you can see by the 18th century, Voltaire and Rousseau, this is not trivial. Millions of people died in peasant wars and in actual wars and in the English Revolution, the Cromwellian Revolution. And what is so interesting, well, before I get to Oliver Cromwell, and believe me, it's a little hard for me to connect all of this, by the way, because, well, I don't know enough. But before I get to that, Karl Marx, he looks back to the struggles in the early modern period. So after Luther, you have the Peasant War in Germany, led by a heroic man by the name of Thomas Munzer. Nobody knows him these days, except if you read Karl Marx's The Peasant Wars in Germany. This peasant uprising led by a priest of the Catholic Church, in the same way that the Protestant Reformation was led by Luther, a bishop, a subject of the church, but a rebellion from within based upon the class differences within Catholicism. And that why should the peasant pay taxes to a regime that did not consider his or her interest? Well, the peasant uprising in the 1820, 1825, 26 in Germany was crushed after a year. But we would see in the same Taiping rebellion in China in the Taiping, I'm sorry. In the 1850s. What was it? These are peasant uprisings. The Chinese Revolution, a peasant uprising in the name of modernity. Indian independence, peasant uprising. Now it's easy for a person today to say, oh, those peasants are just a bunch of dumb people, and if we were ruling them, we would do X, Y, and Z. But you're not going to rule them because they don't give a F about you, you know? The same thing in China, Sun Yat-sen, as a representative of Chinese modernity, Chinese democracy, and a new republic. Mao is just continuing what Sun Yat-sen was doing. You know, and even, you know, a lot of people have a dogmatic and romantic idea of the socialist revolution. Well, it is really a democratic revolution led by people who are socialists and communists. And that's all, I mean, that's basic theory, you know. And a lot of people say, well, China has returned to capitalism. China hasn't returned to anything. China is going forward, solving profound and centuries, millennial old problems such as poverty. And how do you do that? What are the economic mechanisms? The tools that revolutionaries adopt to resolve these problems will differ. time, space, circumstances. But the integrity of revolutionaries and of the revolutionary vision is what is important. This is, we can come back to this, we can debate this, because this relates very much to the American revolutionary process. And of course, the third and fourth American revolutions as we think. But nonetheless, the European Enlightenment of the 1600 and 1700s, leading to the rise of figures such as Isaac Newton, Galileo Galilei. These were not small matters. The idea that the earth revolved around the sun rather than the opposite was a way of talking about the centrality of the human as opposed to the centrality of God. I should say about the medieval construction of God, it was a fiction to justify state power remaining in the hands of those who oppress the majority. It was a way of saying to the majority, you are where you are because it is ordained by God. And we, the ruling class, are merely carrying out the mandate of heaven. Well, that's Chinese. The mandate of God, and that's why an emperor would always be coronated by the Pope, and even in Tsarist Russia, you would see the head of the Orthodox Church side by side with the Tsar. Okay, I've gone a little too far. But the English Revolution is very important because it was never completed. The English Revolution of the 1600s it took on the form of a struggle between Parliament, the people's institution, and the crown. These wars went on for about 40 years, and a compromise was reached where you had a parliamentary, or what they would call a constitutional monarchy. The two could coexist. The French Revolution, which comes approximately 100 years later, cuts off the heads of the queen, and we're trying to hunt down all the other people to biologically or physically eliminate the old ruling class and their representatives. Ultimately, in France, it would be a compromise, but a weak one. That's why, if you study the French Revolution, the first thing they do is to establish a parliament and political parties. The concept of left and right comes dead out of the French Revolution. And the diversity of the revolutionary forces in France is just stunning, including what they today would call the far left, consisting of the communards, the communists, even then. In fact, Karl Marx, when he talks about the three foundations of Marxism, he says there's English political economy, German philosophy, and French socialism. And the socialist movement in France crystallized in the Revolution of 1789. But then Napoleon comes, everybody thinks this guy is going to free everybody and he's going to spread the French Revolution throughout Europe. The Germans, awaited the French armies, the Napoleonic armies, with excitement, and Beethoven writes, I think it's the Ninth Symphony, in honor of Napoleon. And then when he discovers that Napoleon is just like the other emperors, he is not a democrat, he wants to build an empire. And so Beethoven renames the Ninth Symphony. And of course, the Napoleonic Wars in Russia. So Napoleon sets a paradigm for the appropriation of revolutionary ideas for their opposite. And it would be that way going forward. We see that with the American Empire. In that sense, they're very Napoleonic, or counter-revolutionary. But the Napoleonic Wars and the defeat of Napoleon creates conditions for Europe to liberate itself from the remaining vestiges of feudalism and the medieval period, which in a lot of ways it never did. I'll come back to that in a minute. But in France, and it's almost parallel to what we see in this country after the Third American Revolution, where the revolutionary forces are dismantled and, how would you put it, fake revolutionaries are put in their place. Okay. In France, you have, with Napoleon going down and the French political system going into chaos, I guess, going into chaos, this kind of farcical development of people who claim then to be carrying on the legacy of Napoleon Bonaparte. So this is the beginning, or this is the crystallization of a form of political leadership of the state known as Bonapartism. And this, again, I'm referring to Marx again, where farce comes after tragedy. The tragedy is the undoing of the French Revolution and the rise of Napoleon. The farce is for all of these, perpetrators to come forward and claim the, quote, greatness of the French Empire and Napoleon. And Louis Bonaparte is probably the most famous. Louis Bonaparte was famous for the statement, "I am the state and the state is me." Which is the complete opposite of the French Revolution and of the English Revolution and of the American Revolution. France will then go into a descent into a political stasis. It will, France will, become what it is today. I'll come back to that. But one of the interesting things is that when Europe hits the 20th century, a new set of crises break out. And these crises are more connected to colonialism and colonial empires. And hence, Du Bois will say that the origins of World War II are in Africa, in the struggle for colonial supremacy in Africa. Most Europeans, historians would not take that as a serious claim, although I think while there are multiple and interacting causes, one cannot rule out that a political crisis in the age of European colonialism and empire must consider the question of colonialism and which European nation would be the dominant colonial one.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I'll just say that. So the 20th century, after this long period, believe me, of war and revolution in Europe, which is great, instructive, and so important. The sad thing is we just don't know it enough. It is not taught. And without teaching it, you can't understand American history. Some people say, well, you're giving a Eurocentric interpretation. No, I'm not giving a Eurocentric, that's what, I have to tell you all sometimes. Well, I taught at a university where Afrocentrism was the dominant ideological position, and it was allowed to become so because it did not challenge anything about white supremacy, American empire, any of that. It was very satisfied with it in the sense of the white man, you do your thing, just give us space to talk about our thing, So, but to speak about this and the crisis of Europe as part of the crisis of the world, and hence the crisis of Europe being a condition for the emancipation of the vast majority of humanity. Without the collapse of, without the crisis which leads to World War I and hence World War II, or in that interregnum, that intermediary period between the two wars, the greatest economic depression in the history of modernity. Without understanding those 30-some years, you cannot understand the rise of China, India, Africa, and the potentiality going forward into the 21st century. As you know, we've talked a lot about the Enlightenment, the Protestant Reformation, and the rise of the centrality of the individual. Very, very important, because that in itself creates a cause célèbre. Now that you could say, well, Thomas Jefferson owned slaves. Indeed, he did. However, here's where I differ with Gerald Horne. The causation of the American Revolution was not to protect slavery, but to create a new state, which in itself was a contradiction to slavery. So a slave owner creates a system which at the same time creates the conditions for the overturning of slavery. But that's historic logic, which is inconvenient for many people. If you're simple-minded, you don't want to hear that. But that is true. So Thomas Jefferson is not just a slave owner, which he was, but he was part of the foundation of the American state. It's either that or remain within the framework of British colonialism and a regime that, well, some would do well. You would probably still have slavery in the United States, but you would not have the modern American state, the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence. But I just want to repeat this, and this is part, I can understand how this is almost mind-boggling. Well, first of all, to most Americans, and because when I think about, people from India, the Indian independence movement was more straightforward. The formation of the Indian state from Gandhi to Nehru to Indira to what we have today. It's a struggle for modernity. But here you have grafted on to a major revolution, a system of labor which contradicted the revolutionary aspiration. But that was not new in modernity. The Enlightenment proclaims the rights of man, proclaims science, proclaims art, proclaims man qua man as the center of the universe, put forward the deistic rather than the theistic understanding of man's relationship to God. God created the world and then he got out of the way. Everything is now on us, so to speak. That's Jefferson. That's the American revolutionaries. Man is morally responsible. Therefore, Jefferson owned slaves, but then I'm talking about the rights. We are all created by a single thing, And he goes to his grave, conflicted morally. How do I reckon? You can't reconcile.
Right.
And so it would take a second American Revolution to resolve the contradiction. Was it a brutal period? Yeah, you're a slave trade, all that. But so was the period of peasant wars in Germany. So was the 30 Years' War, where in our terms would be hundreds of millions of people if we just, given the population of Europe at that time. But in our hundreds of millions. Now, I want to emphasize that the success or failure of a revolution is measured by what class and ideological forces assume control of the state. Every revolution is about, modern revolutions, taking control or seizing power in the name of the people. Just a small, this is why reading Voltaire, reading Rousseau is so enriching. The great modern literature of Europe is not to be trivialized. That's what I'm trying to say. Tolstoy, Les Miserables, Victor Hugo. You don't lose nothing in reading it. It is enriching because it talks about the contradictions of those moments in history. And that is what we want to understand. The contradictions and how they play out in the lives of the ordinary person, the peasant, the worker, the revolutionary, the defeated revolutionary.
Mhm.
The revolutionary lost and turned out.
Mhm. Mhm.
You know what I'm saying? That's Victor Hugo.
Mhm.
Read it. You know, what happens when a nation is invaded and the ruling elite don't speak the language of the people, i.e. the people speak Russian and y'all speaking French. You know, but you're being invaded by a French army under Napoleon.
Mhm.
Who will decide the day?
Mhm.
And so on. It's just so okay, you get my point. You get my fucking and so these people are writing. Voltaire and Rousseau, they're writing in the throes of a revolution. These ain't no cats sitting around armchairing it. Oh, I got my tenured position. These are cats on the edge of existence, life and death. You understand? Hunted down. These are revolutionary works. To a certain extent, we could say John Locke, but the English will always compromise because the Cromwellian Revolution, which they call the dictatorship, and he never denied it. No, that's what he said. But he was defeated. So it was always compromised. The French Revolution, thorough revolution, killed the aristocracy, killed the church, killed anybody that got in our way. And if that wasn't enough, we setting up a different calendar. A revolutionary calendar, everything. You know, you say it's January. No, that ain't January. It is so fascinating. But they were just people like us. They didn't know how to get to where they were aspiring to. They were working it out. And so these intellectuals, they went back to studying Voltaire, they went back to the English Revolution. And most times, most revolutionaries said, we don't want to go the way of the English. I don't care whether it's in philosophy and politics. English thinking, is always a compromise. You see what I'm saying? Always a compromise. Even the best of them. But that's another story. Okay. I'm taking, okay, now. The intellectual history of modernity is defined by science, art, literature, and revolution. By science, we're talking about the discoveries of physics, chemistry, biology. We're talking about Newton, Galileo, and Darwin. In art, we're talking, of course, about what they call the Dutch masters, the Italian painters, and ultimately the counter-revolution in painting against that with the American Cold War artists. They said, let's get paid by the CIA, you know, and keep it real. Yeah. The retreat from realism to a kind of, you know, modernism or postmodernism a la Basquiat.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? Or modernism, Pollock, Jackson Pollock, you know what I'm saying? Or Andy Warhol. That it's all commercial. There is no soul in the art. So when people say soul music, they're talking about the inner life.
Yeah.
A lot of people think when I say soul music, I'm talking about just partying. No, soul music is the exploration of the inner life, the soul. And it is soul music.
Yeah.
You know, it is soul music. Commercial music is music for sale. the Italian and Dutch painters were exploring the soul of man. And by man, I'm talking qua man. Man, qua means ass. And forgive me, I'm not trying to
It's okay.
be anti-modern, but okay. But then, because once one explores the inner life, and this is Baldwin,
Yeah.
of the human being,
Yeah.
one is more optimistic than pessimistic.
Yeah.
In spite of all of the difficulties and contradictions, you discover something in human beings that is cause for optimism.
Right.
Or a belief in the human being.
Right.
That's the point of Baldwin. The belief in the human being. And that is the point of art, except when it aligns itself with empire. Okay? How does it align itself with empire? I consider hip hop to be out of the trajectory of Andy Warhol. It's all for sale. It ain't worth nothing. It's just how much money I could make off of it. You know what I'm saying? I saw a clash of cultures, and this I learned this from Kathy, and then I saw it on there was a YouTube of it, of Lauryn Hill and the Fugees and the Delphonics.
Clash, yeah.
Because, I guess the Fugees' most popular song is based upon the Delphonics, Ready or Not, Here I Come. You know what I'm saying? And so I looked at it and I saw a clash of cultures. I saw, and the song is written by William Hart Muhammad, who we honor. And he said, ready or not, here I come. You can't hide. Gonna find you. And okay, so they're singing, and the Delphonics in this performance, and I guess they were just told that they were going to be on this at the last moment, and there was some technological shit, and because they had to hear, how they have something there so they can hear each other and hear themselves. Well, so they were doing a medley, and they were very respectful of themselves, of the music, and so. And I'm looking, and Lauryn Hill, hey Philly, come on now, the Delphi, we know that. You ain't introducing us to, but it was a clash of culture. One art, one commodity. And that is what in culture, what they call pop culture today is commodity culture. And so, okay, I'm taking too long, I'm going to go faster. The Renaissance gave us art that elevates the human, explores through depictions of various physical types of human beings, including not just men a la the Greek sculptors, but women, and presenting the human in all of its physical typology. In other words, the nude, the modern nude, which takes me back to Barbara Bullock and Jasmine Garden, and how my paintings of Barbara Bullock, people come in my house and they think I'm some kind of freak of nature. Oh, what, he's into pornography? I'm not into no pornography. This is Barbara Bullock. But, a lot of people who, I said, well, if you don't like this, what do you think of Michelangelo?
Yeah.
What do you think of the Dutch masters, of the Italian Renaissance painters who explored physical type and were not afraid of the human? That's the whole point.
Yeah.
We're not or ashamed of the human. Okay. And so this would evolve the Renaissance painting into what we would call social realism and socialist realism. Socialist realism is where not only do we explore the typology of the human physique, but now we want to look at the working class. And here you get Jacob Lawrence, you know, the Great Migration, Black folk, you see what I'm saying? But that was that paralleled the painting of the Russian Revolution. Socialist realism, so we could sometimes just call it social realism. The counter-revolution against that is against the Romeo Beardens, the Jacob Lawrence, the Augusta
Savage,
the Savage, Augusta Savage, the great sculptor, and others. The reaction against that is the Cold War abstraction, where the word realism is not even mentioned any longer. Okay? And then the further crystallization of that is Andy Warhol, where everything is a joke. And ultimately, you get Basquiat, which is, quote, a return to an infantile imagination, which is really not a child's. That is not a child's view of the world. A child is more advanced than that, but they claim this is the way children paint and so on. But chaos. Now, what Andy Warhol did, what he introduces, is a complete commodification of art. That commercials are the modern art. The depiction of the Campbell soup can. Okay, maybe there's something there, I don't know. But it does not investigate the interior life of the human. So I'm saying, and that's why I said, what Kathy told me, and then I saw it, where the Fugees and the Delphonics. And the Delphonics music, of course, is not commodification. The person that wrote most of it, William Hart Muhammad, when he talks about his creative process and his intentionality, it is not the way it was appropriated by the Fugees. And you could see, and I was so happy to see that clash. And it got to the point where that kind of hip hop performance, and I don't know what they supposed to be doing. But now y'all grown people, you're 50 years old, so why are you still acting childlike and like you so, and so the Delphonics were left standing there, not knowing what was going on. While these young men came, all that old jive shit, man. Come on, dog, respect something if you don't respect yourself. That's the other thing. There ain't no shame in their game. But, okay, let me just go. Then literature, the rise of Shakespeare and the modern English language, the modern English literary language. Every modern language, I want to emphasize modern language, is kind of preceded by revolution in the literary language of the people. That's why Chaucer is so vastly different from Shakespeare. That is why in Russia they say Pushkin, the poet, is the father of modern Russian language. You know, the literary language, in many ways, or in most profound ways, constitutes a revolution in language. It is the modernization of the language. And then as it evolves, it becomes common, the common language. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. But Shakespeare is decisive, and not only, but he builds upon the revolution that says the individual. He, in his plays, of course, romance, race, the struggle for power, all of these things. You don't find this in the Greek drama.
Even class, right? Even class
Even
characterization.
yes. And Shakespeare properly read the way Robeson read him and acted him.
Interesting.
Makes you understand the humanity of Shakespeare and the complexity of Shakespeare and how the state and race overlap. That was very, very advanced. So you say, I don't like Shakespeare, you know, whatever. Hey, dog, you just cut yourself off from yourself.
Yeah.
Because the language and the conceptual framework that you think out of, even romantic love, which I will return to. You know what I'm saying? Because see, once you go to the individual, the interior life of the individual, I'm feeling a certain way. That's my interior life. I'm feeling love. I'm feeling romance. You know, they were teenagers, Romeo and Juliet. Why? Because they're highly sexual at that age. You see what I'm saying? Now they try to use Viagra to get it back up. But on the natural side, you can't. Look, once you lose it, it's gone. All I can tell you is work out. You know, maybe you get the blood flowing. But yeah, from him. But he had to have teenagers because it had to be intense sexual romantic love for which you will die. That's how intense the feelings are. But it's real. But without the revolution which centers the individual, who gives a damn about what you think? You either live by the rules of God or die. You know, live or die, so to speak. You know, I could tell a story, but I ain't gonna. But this revolution in the interior life was manifested in the United States in the youth revolution of the 1960s and 70s. When they said the summer of love, they were not talking about agape love. Believe me. If they were, they didn't have to get naked. You know, like it was, because it was sexual love, it was intimacy. Give me the freedom to feel what I feel. You understand what I'm saying? Don't tell me to feel like you feel and you 70 years old. You ain't got nothing happening no more. Well, I was gonna say lost and turned out, but yeah, you see the point. And then revolution. And that's why I mentioned 3 great revolutions of the age of revolution: the American, French, and Haitian. We are still now, some people call the period we're living in now late modernity. I don't see it that way. Indeed, Europe is exhausted. Europe is more like a museum. If you want to go and see old shit, go to museum, go to Europe. The people are saying, look, we're tired, we've been through too much, we fucked ourselves up in these wars and colonialism, and the ruling class led us down the primrose path. Now you got us involved in Ukraine, and this fool here, Biden, trying to get us involved in the Red Sea and fucking with them cats over there, which is a no-win situation. The Houthi, or who's it called?
Ansar Allah.
Ansar Allah. And that word, whenever you see that Allah, it's like, Allah. Hey man, then you know you up against something, because I'm not just acting on my own behalf. It is Allah. And I'm gonna get you one way or the other. But I just say, Ansar Allah. I mean, so Europe is tired. What they're trying to let us hold together the welfare state. Give me some free health care, education, and let me chill. Legalize heroin. Yeah, you got to legalize drugs. Because I'm too alienated, I'm too tired. I have no meaning, nor do I have a way to search for meaning. That's different than the United States. Europe is very different than the United States. And it ain't just because they white. It is because the exhaustion after 400 years approximately of war, revolution, rebellion. In the axial age we call modernity, Europe moved humanity forward. Really did. And I'm not hating. They did. You have to assess it positively. You know what I'm saying? Any historical nihilism, you can only be pessimistic. In a lot of ways, that's why we're a little bit different in our feelings, in the way we, in the free school, the way we feel. Because I don't feel pessimistic. I don't feel nihilistic. I don't feel that there is no hope and that I just have to go for myself and do me and all. I don't feel that. I reject the culture of a ruling class which hates people. Let's start there. Biden, you don't like the American people. And by the way, they don't like you. And you're going to find that out. The people of this country have utter contempt for the American ruling class. And never has it been so intense. Europe, we don't like the ruling class, but shit, fuck it. Just let me live. Here, we don't like the ruling class, we're gonna try to bring them down.
Yes, that's right.
That's what. But I don't consider this late modernity, nor do I consider us on the threshold of a new axial age. The axis remains the same, although the center of it has shifted to the Afro-Asiatic world. Makes sense.
Well, why does that happen?
Well, because there is no modern revolutionary of Asia, Africa, that rejects modernity. Now, maybe a couple hundred years from now, we will enter new axial age. Maybe that is what the communist reorganization of society will be. But we can't say. You see where I'm coming from? Yeah. But see, have you ever heard this cat named Dugan out of Russia?
No.
Dugan. My man, Dugan. Dugan is a philosopher of the, he calls the fourth wave or fourth.
Political theory.
Yeah. You, and he, he says, to go forward, we have to go back to Hegel. Now, I agree. Hegel is indispensable for understanding or explaining modern knowledge, science. That's what he was trying to do. However, like he says, Marx was a Hegelian, a left Hegelian. Well, I wouldn't disagree with that. But then Dugan says that Marx bastardized Hegel. I do disagree with that. Now, but even if one takes Hegel, you cannot separate him from Kant, Spinoza, or Descartes. You can't. It is something, or Newton, or Galileo, or whatever, or from the French Revolution. The thing with Dugan, it is that it is philosophy outside of history. It is philosophy without the materiality of the world. And it is philosophy that is blind to the radical and revolutionary changes which have occurred since the Russian Revolution. See, what he is saying is that the West as civilization can be reignited, can be resuscitated. My argument is that no, the world and humanity have moved forward, that the moment will be enlivened, the renaissance of humanity from a new civilizational, ideological center of humanity. And indeed, you could say, well, the Chinese are not like the Indians, the Chinese are not like the Africans. But one thing we do know, that all of these people had one thing in common. They suffered colonialism, semi-colonialism, slavery, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So a person, if Xi Jinping goes to South Africa, they're going to say, hey, brother, what's happening? That sounds like Marvin Gaye. What's going on? Brother, what's that? Because they, as they say, game recognized game. Yeah. You were oppressed, we were oppressed by the same people. Right. You know what I'm saying? So, or I don't know about Modi. How he going to navigate the Afro-Asiatic world when he always sitting up there with some white people and talking trash and down with this Israeli? So I don't know how you're going to navigate that, but that's on him. But when Indira or Nehru or Ramesh, my man, whenever they went out, the world said, hey, man, what's happening? We recognize you. You look more like us than the people that oppressed us look. So that baseline is the framework, the historical framework for a new enlightenment, a new revolution of ideas. And it's all over Xi Jinping. It's all over him. When he's talking about a renaissance that is not limited to China. Xi is not as they try to say over here, another Chinese emperor. No, he ain't. That ain't his dialogue. Because the Chinese emperors, what did they believe in? The Middle Kingdom. That we don't have to go nowhere. Everybody will come to us. Because we are the center of civilization. That's the way the Chinese thought, the Chinese emperor. But Xi ain't like that. He's saying Belt and Road. You know what I'm saying? Win-win. Isolate the white man. That's the subtext. People that can dig it, I dig exactly what you're saying, man. You don't have to say nothing. I see the way you carry yourself, your body language. You understand? Just like Alice's dad said, I never wanted to expose to you how much I hate the white man. That's what and so Alice said, I picked it up in your body language. Because there is that. So when they see Hamas, they say, shit, y'all ain't did nothing wrong. That's the white imaginary that say you wrong.
Yeah. Yeah.
But okay, look, I'm only bullshitting. Okay. So we come to this new moment. For us, the American people, it is Du Bois, King, and Baldwin. Maybe not exclusively, but somehow you got to start there. If you're going to begin with a postmodern gender analysis, you ain't going nowhere. It's too narrow. You understand? If you think Audre Lorde replaces Baldwin, well, get off that weed you're smoking. That self-referential thing is not the point. It is, or if you, just like Purple was telling me, she was looking at a podcast. What was it called?
Finding James Baldwin, the Magpie Years.
Yeah, the Magpie Years. Okay, it's high school years. And in their interpretation of Baldwin, they separate him from King. That's not possible. He admired Malcolm. He admired the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. He came to understand his father, that is his stepfather, that is Baldwin. But Baldwin, when you read him, I would say, first of all, he is channeling King, but he is delving into the complexities unleashed by the Third American Revolution.
Yes.
And so I taught, Emily reads and others, they read the novels of Baldwin so well. And I highly, because I forgot, the plots and the characters and so on. But what I learned from them in the free schools reading of the novels is that in so many instances, Baldwin is reconciling himself to his father, to his community, but he is reconciling himself to his own interior life, but not separate from world history, from struggle. I think these figures in their literary work play a role comparable to Voltaire and Rousseau in the French Revolution. And that's why, and I guess we'll talk about it more. We say that the ideological preconditions for the revolution that the country must go through are to be found in the Black radical tradition of ideas and thought. That there is such a thing as a Black proletarian imaginary. Baldwin, when he says the singers that he likes, they're all Black. Why is that? Because of the parallel imaginaries. I hear Donna Washington, although you on the other side of the color line have been socialized not to hear it. I hear the blues. Bessie Smith don't mean to you what she mean to me. You know what I'm saying? Because he like Patti LaBelle. He like Aretha. What is he hearing that the people who control aesthetics and music critique, what don't you hear? Why can you so easily, like I heard a cat saying, the Beatles are the greatest musical achievement of the 20th century. I mean, what? Like Little Richard said, you ain't nothing but an imitation of me. You know, Little Richard. He said all of that. James Brown, the Beatles, Tina Turner, all come out of him. And when you look at it, it's true. So he said, well, y'all ain't did nothing but imitate me and then come back here and tell me I ain't did nothing. But anyway, that's a whole nother question. But who is Little Richard? Who is Little Richard? But y'all ever hear Little Richard? I don't mean to talk about ancient history, but what is it? It is a distinct imaginary. It is a distinct, shouldn't I be down, depressed, and sad all the time, given what I done gone through? I should be, but I'm not. That imaginary. Okay, I'm gonna stop there. You can never talk.
Yeah, that was great.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
So there are a lot of comments. Should we
Oh,
go first?
yeah.
Well, besides, I'll skip people's good mornings. But okay, I'll skip the off-topic one too. Amiri Banks says, the new era must be defined by an axis of peace.
Say that
The new era must be defined by an axis of peace.
True.
There can be no centering of any one people, but there must be a veneration and scientific study of all peoples and languages.
Okay.
Oh, he says, okay, this is towards Afrocentrism. Afrocentrism is a response to colonial regimes, yet fails to acknowledge, as Doc has, the complexities and nuances of all human history, which predates modern framings of Blackness, diaspora, or Africa.
Say that one more time, yeah. Could you read that one more time?
Afrocentrism is a response to colonial regimes, yet fails to acknowledge, as Doc has, the complexities and nuances of all human history, which predates modern framings of Blackness, diaspora, or Africa. Framings which themselves are rooted in cultural nationalist, phenotype obsessed identity politics and tribalism, endangering the axes of peace which revolution seeks to achieve. Doc is speaking.
Okay.
And then Derek is couldn't make it today, but he says, good morning, very interesting points being on table this morning. New lines to ponder on, human complexities, developments, early human developments, artistic phenomenons, ongoing worldwide. And Amiri also says, the collapse of narrative hegemony that was discussed last week is reflected in this conversation around the genetic foundations of humanity in Africa and the reclaiming of Asian. Anyways, the rebranding of Western Asia was a failure. Without shifts in words, ideas, emotions, and relationships, there is no action. Revolution requires deep, principled, committed struggle and study with ideas, art, history. Witnessing every aspect of modern society's development nurtures the moral and spiritual core of revolution. James Baldwin became a revolutionary by falling in love with the world and situating himself as a Black American within a rich global civilization. This is why Baldwin confronts the fact that he has white ancestors and is a part of the same peoples who birthed someone with as many contradictions as Jefferson. He recognized King's World House. And then Christopher Romero says, the way I see it, since we are not taught to recognize contradictions, especially within historical context, people default to the binary mentality of good versus evil.
Mhm.
We are taught to view it in a very constrained view rather than viewing as multiple events happening at once, living motion. Last point of my comment, but I view it as quote unquote radicals attempting to be radical while utilizing the exact framework of ruling class institutions rather than changing the framework for a modern time. And Future Homestead says, I'm learning so much today. Thank you. Okay, back to Amiri. Martin Luther King Jr. loved to understand the artists, scientists, and revolutionaries of Europe. Baldwin adored Dostoevsky just as much as Bessie Smith. And their first language was English. This is undeniable. Commodification insults the child and is ashamed of the human. It lacks deep personal relationships to nature, the cosmos, and other living organisms. We must confront this cultural clash in our music. Thank you for that analysis of music. We need to reconcile the contradictions in art and interrogate music, film, and all forms of art with the same serious study that we apply to everything else. Little Richard ate ancient. Real recognizes real. Doc. Audre Lorde and James Baldwin don't exist without James Baldwin. Audre Lorde and James Brown don't exist without James Baldwin and Little Richard. And then back to Beethoven. Heike Emil's mom clarifies that it's the third symphony.
It's the third.
Yeah, it was Beethoven's third symphony that he renamed Heroica, not the ninth.
Okay.
And then back. So the good mornings are Future Homestead, Michelle from the West Coast, Jake, Todd, Marty all say good morning. And then there was a side question about James Baldwin, which I'll just say quickly. But Future Homestead says, sorry to go off topic. I was reading a book called Finks this week. It has a chapter about Baldwin and his ties to the Paris Review and the CIA. I was wondering what your thoughts were on this, but maybe we can get into that later.
Can I just say something very quickly? The Writers' Conference of 1956, known as the Writers' Vendôme in Paris, indeed, many of the writers wrote for the Paris Review. Unbeknownst to many of them, or most of them, that it was being funded by the CIA. So that was that early period of the 1950s where the CIA was trying to use so-called soft power. Baldwin, I mean, if the question is to suggest that Baldwin was an agent of the CIA or an unconscious agent of the CIA, nothing could be further from the truth. I mean, just absolutely not so.
He discusses it. He talked about it later, right?
Yeah.
Yes, I forget which one.
Yes, Princess and Power.
Yeah, Princess and Power, yes, yes.
But well, can I ask some questions about? But first of all, I wanted to say, today's coming into today's discussion, I was reminded of when we were doing the Robeson event, and there's this notion that others say that Robeson was a Renaissance man, and we pushed back saying he was not merely a Renaissance man. He was much more than a Renaissance man, because ultimately the Renaissance is a great step forward, but is incomplete. And Robeson, in many ways, coming 500 odd years later, is a figure of a movement, with the potential to complete the vision of the Renaissance and even the Enlightenment. And it seems to me that this whole discussion of Martin Luther and Protestantism, obviously Protestantism and the Renaissance are quite related. And so I wanted to ask more about this point you made about the fact that we are, you were saying we're not in a new axial age, and so the way I would interpret that is that still the central issues the core issues are the same from 1517 until now.
Right.
And it seems to me that the significance of the Protestant Reformation is as you said, the sovereignty of the individual, or the struggle for the sovereignty of the individual. And of course, that's like very tied up with the notion of democracy.
Right.
And that is, and one can argue, and I think following from what you're saying, that even Marxism and the struggle for socialism is emerging out of that set of contradictions around the struggle for the individual and democracy
and law and the law. I'm sorry.
Okay. Right. So I guess my question is, or my thoughts, I guess, are, so there's this I guess one could say tension or competing notions of the individual and the collective, right? And often the way that we are taught about Western liberalism or liberalism with a small L is that, oh, this is empowering the individual, and then the kind of stereotype or maybe straw fear mongering thing of communism and authoritarianism is that, oh, this is putting the collective above the individual and the state above the individual. Like that's kind of what's portrayed. And it's Western liberalism that is empowering the individual. And at the same time, even with Marx, in Marxism, they talk about, oh, feudalism and feudal society in some ways had a notion of the collective. Even I see you're speaking about the English Revolution. So I was thinking of when I was reading E.P. Thompson's Making of the English Working Class. He's a historian of labor in England. But he basically talks about like, oh, under feudalism, like there was kind of a somewhat of a social safety net the peasants had and so on. The Lord had to take care of them at certain festivals, give them food and so on. But then with the development of capitalism, that all goes away. There's more suffering and misery. So, there's a kind of feudal, one could say, collectivism. But then in theories of socialism and indeed, communism, there's also an idea of the collective and the fact that I guess one could say liberal notion of individual rights is not the ultimate goal. There's a bigger goal of social liberation and so on. So I don't know if it's making sense, but I wanted to ask, how do you see that? How can we understand that with this thing of the axial? Because you said that we are still in the same axial age from 15 to 17, but then you're also discussing the fact that we perhaps are in a new and have the potential for a new enlightenment as well. So if you could say more about those.
Well, just on that last point of the individual and the collective, in part it was addressed or attempted to be addressed by Rousseau in the idea of the social contract, that the state, in a sense, the state of the whole people, the entire people, I hear you very much. This is kind of what you get in people like Dugin or Putin, that the idea that the Russian Revolution rejected too much of the Enlightenment and did not put adequate ideological, institutional things in place. That's easier to say 100 years out when you're not confronted with the problems of Russia. Russia was only Western at the level of the elites. Russia was Asian, and even the Slavic language is an Asiatic, or you could say a Eurasian language, unlike many of the Western European languages. But I think the Russian Revolution, having to deal with the influence ideologically of Western Europe upon the political education of the revolutionaries, was conflicted. How do you consolidate the revolution in order that the individual can be free, etc. I don't know if they worked it out adequately. Now, if you go to China, the problem doesn't exist that way there, because there is no there is not a strong Western concept of the individual. And even if you take Sun Yat-sen and the Democratic Republic, I would say that Sun Yat-sen and them were looking more at Rousseau than they were John Locke. And that's really the point of contention, almost, and you get it in English political theory, almost an anarchistic, emphasis upon the individual. But in Rousseau, you get this idea, the will of all, that every individual doesn't go his or her own way. Now, in American late modernity, where there is ideological and philosophical and even moral chaos, where there is no concept of the will of all or the general will, or even an idea of a social contract that the ruling class can say, yeah, well, we're prepared to concede everything that you all are demanding, everything, which do not adhere to our, quote, Judeo-Christian value system. But we'll concede it because you have not called for a transformation of the state. You have not called for a new social contract. You are not calling for a peace economy like Amiri is talking about. You have accepted the rule of the ruling class and their ideological hegemony. In other words, your narrative does not, in a fundamental sense, challenge ours. You accept American empire. And it's really what you call you got this philosophical anarchism, it's philosophical nihilism, it's complete nihilism. And that's, when Kathy told me about the Fujis and the Delphonics, it was so apparent to me that the Fujis are completely out of control and they perform a chaos that says to the ruling class, well, we're not going to challenge you. We're not going to challenge your aesthetic, your values. You know what I'm saying? In the way that, for instance, Archie Shepp or Monk or any challenge the fundamental aesthetic and politics of American empire. That's why Kathy's article is so valuable. So if one, I'll just be brief and to the point. See, there is this Anglo-American default to pure individualism. Over here, they call it libertarianism. And they don't know what the hell they're talking. I mean, well, what is a libertarian? I mean, what are you? But in some way, it's kind of a default to an absolute individualism. Get the government out of my business, I'll do my thing, leave me alone, and it's foolishness. But Rousseau talks about a social contract. The state must have a social contract with the citizen. Well, that's what China is. That's what Xi Jinping and them are. They find more resonance in their civilization with that kind of thinking than with the extreme individualism of Anglo-America. So that's what I would say. How this is worked out is not a matter of just theory. It's a matter of practice and history, the way an American Revolution unfolds. And this is why I would say it is important, in fact, decisive, that revolutionaries locate themselves philosophically and ideologically. See, a lot of people say, well, we have to go back to Marx and the early days of the Russian Revolution. Well, maybe you do. But something new was invented here. And just because it's Black don't mean it's less inventive.
Or universal.
My point, the universal concrete or the concrete universal. And see, I contend that most of what goes for Marxism, which is mainly an academic enterprise these days, are guilty of the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. You're taking something that happened in a very different context and trying to concretize it here in this country. When you have a tradition, of rich resistance, but you can't see it because it don't look like what you imagine. That's why we keep talking about the white imaginary. You know, freedom will be brought to the American people through white people, because aren't they the majority? But when was it ever a question of quantitative number counting, except in bourgeois sociology? You see my point? We have the basis of a rich revolutionary moment in this time for this people who are searching. European, they ain't searching for nothing. They've thrown in the towel. They're exhausted.
Right.
But here you have a search, you know, a challenge to the existing order. You know, that's what, I'm sorry if I talk too long.
Yeah. But one thing I was just interested. First of all, I think I'm understanding avant-garde more. Like why we chose that name, because what you were saying about the intellectual history of modernity, how it's defined by these great movements in science, art, and literature.
Yeah.
And how this is so tied to revolution.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess, and of what you said about Shakespeare, and how the literary precedes the language, the creation of the modern language.
Yes, the literary language precedes the common language.
Yeah.
I think that obviously there is some connection.
Yeah.
However, the literary language, where you elevate the common language to something more than the common language is. Let me give you an example.
Right.
It's just like Ella Fitzgerald taking Tin Pan Alley, throwaway, crazy songs, and elevating them to art music.
Right. That was the next question I was going to ask, is where is the folk in this? But I think you just answered my question, that the great artist sees the movements and the culture of the people and elevates it. That's what drives the movement of civilization.
Yes.
That's very clear. And I had something else, but it was really, something else can go. It was a lot.
Yeah, well, the thing that I feel like I'm almost overwhelmed by everything, because I think the thing that I found really important was kind of what Jahan was saying about identifying, first of all, the concept of an axial, an axial age, and that there've been three, and that the one we live in today, and it's not that we're not looking for a new axial age, but that there's an axial age of modernity that begins with the Protestant Reformation.
Kind of, yeah. Some would say the Italian Renaissance and so, but
But I feel like that's really important, because even the way people talk about that today is a clash of civilizations, I think is interesting. In some ways, there's something important about, like, even when you're talking about how, well, this is akin, the single garment of destiny, or a world house, which is that when Xi Jinping talks, it's not about engaging in a clash of civilizations, but rather a recognition of an axial age of modernity that's trying to be achieved by world humanity. And I also feel like I like the way we're talking about modernity too, because, and also America's role in it. But I'm really stuck on the way you talked about how, like, the intellectual history of modernity and the way you laid it out by science, art, literature, and revolution, because there's something about those categories and the way you delved into all of them that sets the scene for James Baldwin or Martin Luther King Jr.
Yeah.
And I know I'm not being specific, but I feel like there's something important about that because it also helps reframe James Baldwin.
Yep.
Because James Baldwin is very much, he's not just a modern man, because in some ways we talk about James Baldwin as both ancient and new. And in some ways, it's not just that he's a modern man, but it's that he speaks to the modern man. It's that he's, that's like the prophetic, that's like James Baldwin, the prophet. But because even when I found that when you were talking, I was like, oh, actually, you're describing James Baldwin philosophically so perfectly. But even when you're talking about majority, where why is it that in America there's an assumption that it is white people who will bear or determine the future of American civilization if there is to be one, just based on a bourgeois sociological
Yes,
understanding of statistics of white people as the majority. Because you reminded me of James Baldwin's essay In Search of a Majority, where he says the exact same thing, except in some ways I need to now reread the essay because you kind of redefined it, where he talks about, well, let us like first ask the question of what do we mean by majority? Because he even says he says as long as we can deal with the Negro as a kind of statistic, as something to be manipulated, something to be fled from, or something to be given something to, there's something we can avoid. And what we can avoid is what he really, really means to us. The question that still ends these discussions is an extraordinary question. Would you let your sister marry one? The question, by the way, depends on several extraordinary assumptions. First of all, it assumes, if I may say so, that I want to marry your sister. And it also assumes that if I asked your sister to marry me, she would immediately say yes. There's no reason to make either of these assumptions, which are clearly irrational. And the key to why these assumptions are held is not to be found by asking Negroes. The key to why these assumptions are held has something to do with some insecurity in the people who hold them. It is only, after all, too clear that everyone born is going to have a rather difficult time getting through his life. It is only too clear that people fall in love according to some principle that we have not as yet been able to define, to discover, or to isolate, and that marriage depends entirely on the two people involved. So that this objection does not hold water. It certainly is not justification for segregated schools or for ghettos or for mobs. I suggest that the role of the Negro in American life has something to do with our concept of what God is. And from my point of view, this concept is not big enough. It has got to be made much bigger than it is because God is, after all, not anybody's toy. To be with God is really to be involved with some enormous, overwhelming desire and joy and power which you cannot control, which controls you. I conceive of my own life as a journey towards something I do not understand, which in the going toward makes me better. I conceive of God, in fact, as a means of liberation and not a means to control others. Love does not begin and end the way we seem to think it does. Love is a battle. Love is a war. Love is a growing up. No one in the world, in the entire world, knows more, knows Americans better, or, as odd as this may sound, loves them more than the American Negro. This is because he has had to watch you, outwit you, deal with you, and bear you, and sometimes even bleed and die with you. Ever since we got here, that is, since both of us, black and white, got here, and this is a wedding. Whether I like it or not, or whether you like it or not, we are bound together forever. We are part of each other. What is happening to every Negro in the country at any time is also happening to you. There's no way around this. I'm suggesting that these walls, these artificial walls, which have been up so long to protect us from something we fear, must come down. I think that what we really have to do is to create a country in which there are no minorities for the first time in the history of the world. The one thing that all Americans have in common is that they have no other identity apart from the identity which is being achieved on this continent. This is not the English necessity or the Chinese necessity or the French necessity, but they are born into a framework which allows them their identity. The necessity of Americans to achieve an identity is a historical and a present personal fact. And this is the connection between you and me. And then this is just the last paragraph. This brings me back in a way to where I started. I said that we couldn't talk about minorities until we had talked about majorities. And I also said that majorities had nothing to do with numbers or with power, but with influence, with moral influence, And I want to suggest this,
Wow.
that the majority for which everyone is seeking, which must reassess and release us from from our past and deal with the present and create standards worthy of what a man may be, this majority is you. No one else can do it. The world is before you, and you need not take it or leave it as it was when you came in. But yeah, and okay, that also brings me to the point that, okay, the reason why I actually like seeing the axial age of modernity, which we live in today, which it still continues because it's something we're working on achieving or like progressing, is I like that the identification of it with the Protestant Reformation because even how you were describing the change from believing man is controlled by, ordained by God, versus, which means man as stagnant versus man as an agent, or man having agency, is I feel like that's connected to the way we are also saying that the future of an American civilization must come from like the Black imaginary, like the Black freedom struggle, because even this thing of like soul, the way you talked about like soul music, that in some ways the task, and it's not just an American task, but it is a contribution that is always being made and has to be made by the American people. It's a contribution to the world, is because we all live in an axial age of modernity.
Yes.
It's the contribution of like something that in some ways the Black proletariat imaginary has always talked about, and that's soul music. And it's the music, it's like it's what Baldwin calls the achieving an identity that is both historical and a present personal fact, or like, I don't know, in inner world.
Yeah.
And it's the way that we also, I don't know, it's the way that you talked about how once you can go into an inner life or explore the inner life, and in some ways I feel like that has roots in the Protestant Reformation or something, that you end up with something that is optimistic and never pessimistic. And that's civilization.
Yes. Yes, from a God-centered to a human-centered.
Yeah.
And this is where Shakespeare and Baldwin,
Yeah.
where you get, this is where Baldwin, can I just interrupt you? This is where Baldwin's exploration of human desire is different than the modern LGBTQ.
Yes.
See, I contend that the modern LGBTQ movement is a completely nihilistic, pessimistic movement about even people who identify as queer. It does not allow for a way out.
Yeah, right.
You are not more free. You will be less free because you'll be more. What Baldwin says, and this is that the interior, but just like you put it, is so connected to the historical movement. And I'll just shut. That's all. Yes.
Well, what did you mean by like ancient and new? Because with this whole, like, I also understand that because the ages also deal with the level of human, like spiritual and like a definite, like, how do you say it? It deals with a different understanding, different framing of the world, and expounding of the world, which is a deep thing. Like that's like something that shakes. So I understand that the ages are these is a different question than, where the center, like the question of the center, meaning because the question of the center to me regards like what motivates history and how does history also develop and also towards what. But when you said with Baldwin being ancient and new, are you saying new in the case of this arising center, or new in the case of our age that has not completely achieved itself?
Well, that's so interesting.
Because to me, that's what I think
is closer because Baldwin is an achievement of something that hasn't, or he was working out, like you were saying, working out. Because you're saying channeling King, but working out the complexities of the particular moment. In this case, I think I used to think it was like American. You know what I'm saying? Well, because America is dealing with slavery, man as man, like men were understood not as men, then thus achieving manhood.
Yeah.
But then what I was also considering in the past couple of weeks, I was mentioning how much America has to teach to the world and has in effect taught the world, which is kind of what we're saying too. Like, what does in this case Xi Jinping refer to if not King? But he would have to. You know what I'm saying? Like that world house that we're saying. Like, but what that makes me think though is the achievement of modernity, where man is of man, like the whole thing about what you said about God is a struggle, or like Doc had written a note of that God is a struggle off of what you have read from Baldwin, thinking that God is enormous, this joy, that hints to me something about the development or what could be possible of the human being, based upon the Third American Revolution, which is almost like trying to actualize what you're saying, Luther, or that question, where can you locate God and use it? You know what I'm saying?
Well, I think actually the reason why I said ancient is because I was thinking about the Old and New Testament.
Absolutely.
Because in some ways, like the ancient, yeah, basically something about modern. It's because in some ways it's like modern man is still trying to achieve or make sense of.
Right. No, keep going. That's very, very important, because if I could just say, this is, see, when I use it, I'm thinking of the tradition of the prophets. Because see, the prophets of the Hebraic and of the Hebraic tradition are part of that second axial age. The second axial age. You know what I'm saying? And that in fact, Moses comes out of the pharaohs, Akhenaten in particular. And so the Jews, quote unquote, the Hebrews, the 12 tribes, as it were, did not see themselves as separate from the pharaonic Egypt. They saw themselves as revolutionaries within pharaonic Egypt. Now, ancient, in the way I use it, the Old Testament, Old and New Testament, is the tradition of prophecy, the prophetic, the imaginary. That's what I'm going to call it. So I try to think of Baldwin as attempting to bring the two together, because you hear one lesson, you hear all of these commentators, I don't know so much today, modern man is secular man. Baldwin doesn't accept that. He sees the modern as one with the prophetic. And of course, the Black prophetic tradition, the Black, where it's difficult to imagine Black people talking about secular man. Man is secular. Man is secular man seeking meaning, and you heard all of that bullshit.
Like the individual thing.
That's right. Man has no meaning because man is cut off from community, and but man is condemned to freedom. I mean, there's been so much horseshit kicked down this. I mean, I mean, it's just like breathtaking. How much bullshit can you continue to perpetrate? You know, you probably heard it if you went and, you know, in any kind of court, man, secular man is condemned to be free.
That's existentialism. Right?
Yeah, but it's also libertarianism. It's Hannah Arendt, you know, and Soviet Russia, you know, is a threat to freedom. Well, you hear, well, that's Joe Biden. But I'm sorry.
Well, just the other small thing in my mind is just this, that it's kind of just a selfish question, because the concrete universal and like that whole concept is to be it seems like alongside this question of like synthesis, really, because essentially when it comes to the, like, what you had mentioned about like the secular, modern, and the ancient is like this synthesis, basically a new framing of what it means to be a human being, which to me is very logical, because it seems like I think it's very similar to it. But that's only also because of the age that we live in, what has happened in the past, and people Baldwin. Because so like on the table is also new syntheses, scientific discoveries, and I think part of when you said last week, like, our calling of our generation is that of like to struggle for peace. Like, I think to make possible these syntheses is why we say, or why we explain the Black radical tradition, why you ended with Du Bois, Baldwin, and King, because through what principle can we make syntheses?
Right. Or can I just suggest, now, I would not use, when I talk about Baldwin speaking to the language of the Bible and of the modern human search for meaning. Because see, what I was trying to avoid is this modern man as somehow so unique and so, as they say, sui generis, a thing to himself, as opposed to because Baldwin is hearing King. King is speaking prophetically and rationally. Because that's King, you know, when he talks about cosmic partnership.
Yeah.
What is that? And how does that relate to the modern struggle for freedom? And that, for me, and that's what has to be answered, but I'm sorry.
But what I'm explaining is that the white world order, imperialism, seeks to also divide that basic understanding of what you're saying.
Absolutely.
Like
absolutely.
the consciousness of the people.
And then to make a clash of civilization the substitute for the struggle for freedom in a new age. Because what Huntington and a clash of civilization means that we stop at the European Enlightenment.
Yeah, the true racism is just,
The true racism.
no, I was gonna say that, like, the really racist idea is to say that the darker nations do not constitute human,
Absolutely. Or a threat to civilization.
or a threat to modernity.
That's what they,
Yeah,
a threat to modernity.
Just in parentheses, the subaltern school has this same assumption. That like the peasantry, I was thinking, because you were talking about the peasant revolutions also as constitutive of modernity, but the way the subaltern school will put it is that the peasants are pre-modern and they're inconvenient to a modern analysis. No, they make modernity. They're the progenitors of the Indian state. But
and that's what Gandhi proved.
Yeah.
That's what Gandhi. But go ahead.
That's fine. I was thinking a lot about, I think, Serafina, the way you said seeking a human in God, or God, seeking human beings in this idea of God, and seeking God in human beings, and how sort of That's sort of a natural relationship. And when that becomes detached is when we find ourselves, I think, oriented in what King called the colony of time instead of the empire of eternity. And sort of that sort of relationship that we have towards the ancient and the new is bringing those things together instead of trying to stay in this static rejection of modernity, rejection of that struggle and that relationship. I picked up this book by Michael Hudson. He wrote this book called Forgive Them for Their Debts. And it's about basically all of the stories of the Bronze Age in the Torah and how they were so relatable economically to him, in that like basically these certain classes would rise up and overtax the population to the point where society couldn't sustain itself. And the kings would have to basically give out these jubilees to forgive them for their debts so that they could continue society functioning.
Yeah, that's right.
And so this is kind of a recurring theme of this colony of time, which is represented by every elite class that develops, that wants to hold back people from the relationship with God, and how, you know, in order for us to reconstitute ourselves with our ancient struggle and our modern man, we must adhere to principles beyond which the form has taken. I feel like I'm making this more complicated than I need to, but basically I feel like in the current time that we live in, and what you're talking about being commercialized and art just being for sale, is an orientation towards form, an orientation to what looks human. You know, libertarianism, individualism seems human on the surface, but it's detached from everything that made a human being.
That's right.
And so, you know, in order to really access, you know, the sovereignty of man, as you're saying, instead of the sovereignty of God, is recognizing those things have a contradiction, and that our purpose is to synthesize and resolve that through this struggle, through this adherence to content and orientation to content, which goes beyond these, you know, this static rejection of that relationship. So we see, you know, it's interesting. My mom sent me this piece of art. I suppose it is. This person was saying what America was, and I guess it was a poem. It seemed like a proclamation. It's like America is trans, America is gay, America is black, America, all these things, all these identities that we're supposed to adhere to, always seem to be static representations of an identity. It's not really a relationship. Because if you say America, it's working class, all of a sudden you're talking about a relationship, right? You just say you're black or trans, you don't necessarily have to deal with like a relation to production, a relation between a struggle. You know what I mean? You can then say that, but it's just sort of, again, it's an abstract. It's an abstract. Adherence to the form, to the content, to the abstract, and not.
Can I just? I agree. See, the question is the Baldwinian question: the human, the soul. You know what I'm saying? But I just, this is so important. This is why this empire of eternity. What does King mean? What does he mean by that? And I agree with you that the colony of time is to stop the movement of history.
Well, it's, you know, it's the colony of time is an important thing to recognize, that we are human beings stuck in our own place in time, and that we are constricted by that individually and by our moment in time, and that there are forces in that time that try to keep us there. They try to hold that line, you know? And so not to just reject it out of hand.
Absolutely.
To take it all in one, you know, understanding, because that's where, you know, that's when we become dogmatic. We think that we can just supersede the limits of what our current reality is. That's where idealism, you know, I think that's where a lot of these radical, idealistic, you know, wokeisms that we talk about are so uprooted from where America is. Because, I mean, yeah, if you look at the grand total of crimes in America, it's extremely dark, it's extremely racist, extremely violent. But you can't superimpose that on the reality that we're in right now, which is what we talk about, which is a very anti-racist, very peace oriented
This is
people.
very interesting, yes. Forgive me, I just.
This conversation, I was just thinking, this conversation has sort of helped me understand the Indian perspective a little better, because I think that the Indian state was founded on this promise of modernity when Gandhi and Nehru sort of founded the state and they started to build a nation from scratch. It was on the promise of modernity. And I still think that today, under Modi, we still promise the same modernity.
No question.
However, I think that the idea now is something that you were talking about in the very beginning, which is this ahistorical attempt to go back in time to an axial age, which is not of today.
Yes.
You know,
Yes.
and that makes a kind of contradiction appear in how our present, Indian government tries to do things, where it's trying to move forward, but it's also trying to move backwards at the same time.
Absolutely.
And this constitutes a lot of the things that I can't really explain about why the Modi government does what it does. Now I can sort of attribute it to this contradiction,
Yes.
like it goes back to the same contradiction that Americans had during the first American Revolution, where slaves, but the idea of freedom. How do you reconcile that? How do you reconcile what's happening today? So I think that this is also preventing the Modi government from really accepting the very basis on which our freedom struggle was fought. They need to accept Gandhi and Nehru if they have to move forward, which they're unwilling to do. And they're sort of caught in time, in a way, so to speak.
Yeah, and also to move history forward, you have to embrace modernity. I mean, you can't try to go back to anything ancient. You have to, this is the modern, and we will take the reins of history. The West time is over. But you can't get that with this ancient kind of imaginary.
Yeah, it's contradictory. Now we're moving towards an era where we say that India is going to be the fastest rising economy, where our GDP is going to surpass a lot of other countries. We're delving into technologies that we've never, had before. We're moving ahead very, very fast, but at the same time, we're trying to move back into this ancient Hinduism thing. I mean, it's a contradiction. It really is.
This is the problem with cultural nationalism, because they aspire to an ideal past that never existed.
Yeah.
Like with Afrocentrists, they have this conception of Africa that doesn't exist today, nor did it exist in the past. How you were talking about Afrocentrists rely on phenotype, and they say, oh, North Africans, their skin is too white, they're not really Africans.
Yes.
And you therefore divide Africa, unable to resist imperialism in its total unity. But I wanted to talk about the religious aspect and the religious part of the conversation. Because I feel like you can never study religion separate from human beings, because religion is how human beings understand themselves in this world. We've been talking, I don't really understand American Christianity, I'm beginning to. And we've been talking about the Protestant Reformation and the English revolutions, and how the Protestant, in Islamic terms, the Protestant Reformation was about removing the church, and I guess what you said, the state, Muslims would say you go for intercession and intermediary. What's the word? Intercession, with God, and that only God can provide that to you. Whereas the Catholics were saying, well, you have to go to the church, you have to pay the church, you have to pay your teeth, and I think in the Islamic world, there's a movement called Salafism, which is about returning Islam to the Salaf, which are the first 3 generations of the Prophet, and it's become the biggest trend in Islam, even outside of Salafism, but in Sunni Orthodox Islam. And Salafism and Wahhabism has its roots in American and British imperialism. And I think it's what you were saying about the BJP, where people are unsatisfied with today, so they're looking to the past.
Yeah.
But it's a past that's, I don't know how someone else wants to take over, but you can't go back.
I mean, I would compare it to Zionism, where it's a failed ideology that can't attach to anything real. It's an attempt to go back to something that's ethereal in nature.
Well, I think that Israel and Pakistan have a lot in common, where their language is.
Something. We're not on stage like that.
Well, you know, just
We lived there from
to compare it
Some differences.
the state of Pakistan was set up as a secular state. The state of Israel was set up as a secular state, and they became, religious fanatic states over the course of their development. But also the language of Israel, Hebrew Standard, is not really from the Middle East. It's really closer to Yiddish and all those Eastern European immigrants that came. And the language of Pakistan is not really native to Pakistan. It's actually from, I think, Lucknow, India. And
yeah, but I mean, it's a little different because not from Europe. But I see what you're saying.
It's about
a little bit.
It's about the cultural nationalism that distorted the history, distorted,
Right.
Yeah. Similar to Ukraine as well, where the just outright rejection of 30% Russian speakers in their national, and just trying to treat Ukraine as some distinct origin, just like Israel, just like the land back movement too. In different contexts.
Native American.
There's at least more merit to land back in its origins, but it's still attempting to go backwards. That it just doesn't work. History can't be reversed like that.
Right.
Well, because actually the land backing reminded me of something you said, Doc, that I'm still making sense of. I was listening to it on the YouTube as I used the restroom, but it's when you said in America, Jefferson and I guess the founding fathers, it's tried to create a state, tried to create a state that created a state that had a contradiction, and that contradiction was slavery. But at the same time, it's that state as a result of a revolution that also contributed to the removal of slavery. Yeah, and so I don't know, there's something I think important about that or important even about tracing that history, because, well, first of all, it leads to Baldwin and King for a reason, but I don't know. It's there's something important about that being framed by, as basically as a key, both a key ideological but also historical development of modernity, I think. But I guess I'm just trying to make sense of that.
Right.
I think it's.
Oh yeah, because it's related to what you said. I also wrote down what Serafina said, where it's very significant that in America there was a slave, because there were slaves, and I think it's important because it's something you also said. I'm connecting it to something because we've been reading Go Tell It on the Mountain, which is it's a lot more religious than I realized it would be, which sounds dumb because it's called Go Tell It on the Mountain. But it's also because I really don't know Christianity or religion, or it's not my framework because I didn't grow up with it.
Yes.
But it's not just about religion as like a dogmatic religious thing. It's actually a story. I feel like in some ways it's a story of, I'm realizing now that it's more of a story of Old Testament, New Testament, like freedom. It's actually a story about the way human beings or Americans make sense of freedom, like fulfilling of freedom.
Yeah.
And then in the modern man, and the way actually in the modern man, freedom can only be achieved through the black tradition, the black imaginary, which comes from an understanding of the gospel, rather than Old Testament judgment, but New Testament forgiveness, freedom, redemption, Jesus Christ, like Jesus being like the Son of God, get crucified, and so there's something important how you were saying, like you were talking about how there was a time when, like, especially immediately after emancipation, where a generation of African Americans, there were a lot of people who believed maybe there's those who really relied upon the Old Testament, believed maybe we are to blame. Like maybe Black people did something wrong, and that's why God made us slaves. Versus a New Testament, versus the gospel in the New Testament, the belief that like we didn't do anything wrong. Like it's, we didn't do anything wrong, but we are the people of the book who were meant, just like Jesus, to bear this message of freedom. I don't know. I don't feel like there's something important about all that.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry.
Right. Well, anyway, it's this going back to the I guess origins of this discussion. I'm just reflecting on. I mean, look, a lot of people would say, why is this a Eurocentric framework, right? To say that modernity starts with, either 1517 or maybe the Renaissance of 2 centuries before that. But first, I'm thinking back to Du Bois in World in Africa. Yeah, I think it was in chapter 2 or one of the early chapters. He talks about, he basically says something along the lines of, the Renaissance fueled by the war, something that the energies or the ideas of Asia and Africa propelled Europe forward and was a great movement forward and had even greater potential. But in a lot of ways, it was very much weakened or compromised by the development of the color line, then going into the slave trade and colonialism and so on. And so I think it is important that we are not saying that there's something uniquely superior about Germany, for example, that Luther came up with this argument, but there was a whole period of exchange prior to the color line. And, I think like the discussion about Afrocentrism or other forms of cultural nationalism tend to be what you could call like presentist, taking our present world and then projecting it back to let's say the 1300s or the 1400s. But for example, many of the Christian thinkers that were perhaps even influenced, I don't know about Luther himself, but the ones preceding him, they had studied, for example, many of the Islamic thinkers like Avicenna and Averroes, with the Latin names of two important, I think they're both Persian Islamic philosophers, and they influenced a lot of European Christian thought leading up to the Protestant Reformation. And even ancient Greece and ancient Rome, if you had asked let's say Islamic philosopher in, let's say, Baghdad or Cairo in like 1200 1300, like, are Greece and Rome European civilizations, or the Greek and Roman philosophy of European? They would say no, like they're also part of my tradition. Like I'm also studying them and I'm developing philosophy from them, and they belong as much to me as to Christians in Rome or Greece. And similarly, and a lot of it is also from Africa as well. It's interesting, a lot of what we call Greek philosophy is written in the Greek language, but it was actually written in Egypt, and so it's produced in Africa. But the point I was saying was, so Du Bois makes that argument about the Renaissance coming out of Asia and Africa. And of course, an important part of that is also Spain and we were talking about earlier, the Al-Andalus and the Moorish, the African Muslim civilization in Spain, and how that was a period of great exchange that preserved all these ancient philosophical ideas the church had actually tried to destroy. And it was and that had lasted for 700 years. And it was with the fall of that kingdom in 1492, the same year as Columbus came to the New World, that many of this knowledge was rediscovered, and even the writings of these Muslim philosophers was rediscovered by Europeans, and that had a great impact on many of these theologians. And in fact, I actually learned from Mahdi, something he posted on Facebook, that there was a bishop from Ethiopia who had actually visited Germany and had met with Luther. And I don't know the full details of how much that person impacted him, but certainly it shows that there was this exchange that was happening. And so this is also helping me understand something I had read a while ago when I was working on this article about Iqbal for the Vishwa Bandhu Journal, which I'll be interested in your thoughts now after this presentation, because I was trying to also look at how he understood the Enlightenment versus the Iqbal from
Iqbal.
Yeah. So I came across this book by the Soviet author Ulyanovsky about, it was something about the development in Asia and Africa from the 70s. It was written Yes. So he actually made a big deal out of the Protestant Reformation, which I didn't fully understand when I was reading it, because he was saying that the Protestant Reformation is kind of a point of divergence between Europe and Asia and Africa. And he was kind of saying that, in Europe goes down this path of secularism, the divide between church and state, the individual, and he argued, from what I recall, that Asia and pretty much all the religions of Asia and Africa, whether Islam, Buddhism, Confucianism, none of them have experienced that kind of Protestant Reformation and that kind of division between the religious institutions and the person. And from what I understand is he was trying to argue that the anti-colonial movement was in fact trying to take that task on. And so the anti-colonial movement had like this, I guess you could say in Marxist terms, bourgeois democratic element of dealing with the individual and then the social element. And then he was saying like a figure like Gandhi or others are very steeped in religion because they are also because they have a dual task. There's a political and there's this thing of the religious reformation, which is, I'm just recalling that at this discussion. I mean, there's also a separate set of thinkers, like for example from South Asia, that argue that even at the time of Luther and the 1200s forward, there was like a parallel movement of mystics and so on who were trying to do something similar, but they weren't dealing with a centralized church in the way Europe was. So it was a more of a subtle process, but that was blocked by colonialism. But it seems regardless, it seems what we're saying is that in some ways it is also a fait accompli that the ideas from the Protestant Reformation have impacted the whole world, for better or for worse. And that has to be a starting point for moving forward. In fact, there are like some academic scholars of religion and so on that they say that after colonialism, pretty much the elites of most of the world's religions tried to rethink their traditions through the lens of the Protestant Reformation, because being educated in Western ideas and so on. So anyway, the point I just think that I'm just seeing the significance of this more. And then just lastly, this thing of the clash of civilizations is a very ahistoric way of looking at things. Because like as we established, the Protestant Reformation, the Enlightenment, they are part of a great exchange of ideas coming from Asia and Africa. And it's just that kind of cycle, you could argue, is being, coming to a full circle, or it has in the past 100 years or so, where Asian and African revolutionaries and thinkers and so on have then re-engaged the ideas of the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, and then tried to work on a new synthesis of, from their civilizations and so on. And that's kind of the period that we are in. And, the things we are seeing, the struggles for a new world, even the struggles for independence in places like Palestine, is this, cycle being in some ways completed. And that's what we're talking about with the new Enlightenment.
I mean, and if you really want to, I feel like I really understood literature through Rifat Al-Rier's lectures. The martyr of Palestine. He's a professor of English, really worth listening to his lectures on English literature and poetry, because it really captures the revolutionary essence of it. So you really understand what is literature, what is its purpose, who was Shakespeare, who are all these, what do all these figures mean? And why are they important in a way you wouldn't understand in a Western classroom.
But this is something that I was thinking about also, because one of the things that you said was the idea that the ideological history of the modern world is revealed through movements in science and art and literature. And that made me think of this one thing that I remember reading in Dubas's Sociology Hesitant, that I never really fully understood, I think, until now. I don't know if I fully understand it now, but where he's basically making a claim for why sociology should be a science itself. And he says this thing, wait, I don't want to mess it up, let me try and read it. it's just a short quote. So he says, and yet 3 things at the birth of the new age bear weighty testimony to an increased and increasing interest in human deeds: the novel, the trust, and the expansion of Europe. And he starts with the novel. And I never really understood the significance of that. And to qualify the novel, he says what he means by the novel is the study of individual life and motive. You know, and when you were talking about Baldwin and especially his novels and how he's so deliberate with the characters that he creates, where it's just because I've been watching all these podcasts and commentary and narratives on Baldwin and all of that. But it just like sometimes you wonder why are you getting it so wrong? And I think this clarifies why is because they see these characters as whims of Baldwin's imagination, or just like random choices, but not a deliberate approach to understand, what does this basically what is the life world that is being represented through the character, and what is the clash between say a white person's life world or a black person's life world, and all of that. And that is why, and there was even and we've been talking about this idea of the secular versus, and how Baldwin would reject that. In one of these podcasts was making a big deal of how he's America's greatest secular prophet. And I was like, where do you get that formulation? I mean, it almost sounds so artificial, and it just reflects like a complete misunderstanding of what Baldwin represents, the life world that produced him, and the life world that he was trying to shape through what he was writing. But yeah, I've never understood what Dubas is trying to say here, because he literally puts the novel at the same level as Empire and the expansion of Europe.
Yes.
And
the trust.
The organization.
Yeah, I mean it's very interesting because I mean like we were just talking about the significance of literary revolutions. I mean for language, but also for politics and ways of living. Like one thing that I remember reading was like I think it was in maybe the 1700s, but like for example the concept of a career, right? A person having a career, because everything about most people are peasants, no concept of a career, and the word career referred to horses, like the career of a horse, racing horse. Novels written about a person getting a career, and then you're establishing capitalist mode of production. You get a career, and I mean you could trace a lot of concepts of capitalism were first written about in different novels and so on.
Also, the nation.
Yeah, the nation. Yeah. I mean that's the thing. Yeah. But yeah, Baldwin in some ways is a literary, in many ways, a literary revolutionary for another way of being, another way of thinking, and that's kind of, and not that helps. It's a long process of waging revolution, but you need these revolutionary texts and literature.
Let me first do just a few additional comments, and then we'll read. Speaking of Baldwin, we'll read the draft of the vision statement for the year Baldwin. Back to Future Homestead had asked that question about the Paris Review and James Baldwin and the CIA. They just want to clarify. Thank you for answering. I was not making any implications about Baldwin. I was just curious about his history, which is important. It was important to clarify because there's a lot of conspiracy theories. But anyways, Jerome Muhammad says in Susan Williams' book, White Malice. Susan Williams' book, White Malice, the CIA and the Covert Recolonization of Africa. She lists those CIA-financed publications and some of the writers that were published, none of which knew the publications were CIA-financed. Jacob Carpenter adds in, hello, Happy New Year, Free School. Amiri says, Baldwin sought to reconcile the contradictions within himself and humanity. He exemplified the artist as scientist, as a scholar of love, intimacy, morality. The soul merges the ancient and modern. Yeah, and I also wanted to underline that because I really liked what you said, Doc, about this thing of not just Baldwin, but the importance of like soul music, for example, not being afraid of the human being's inner life, but actually emphasizing the importance of like not being ashamed or afraid of that inner life. But I find something, because and then connecting it to the way the Renaissance the whole like whatever news and stuff, but the whole like Renaissance gave us the art that elevates the human, all of its physical topology, aka like the nude form, and what you were saying about how Baldwin, compared to modern LGBTQ plus stuff, actually it's in Baldwin much more is able to actually give a real language and a real understanding of what people would currently call LGBTQ plus, but they misunderstand Baldwin, because Baldwin at the end of the day, he's talking about love and desire, not queerness.
Yeah, yeah.
He's talking about human love, human desire, and not being ashamed of, but it's not an individualistic thing, but rather very much like trying to achieve, like, I don't know, in some ways try to achieve what the Gospels talk about.
Well, this is an interesting, if I could just say something, you know, it's like Mahalia Jackson as compared to Patti LaBelle. And the reason I bring it up is, well, if you take Mahalia Jackson and Dinah Washington, and then Patti LaBelle, Mahalia, for most of her career, refused to sing secular music in secular venues. The only time she did it was for the music of Ellington. And she says, if it wasn't for Duke, I wouldn't have done this. It's so interesting when she's singing on the 23rd song, she's singing Come Sunday, that Ellington music, which stretched her voice, because she's a contralto and, deep. But then Aretha is blues and early gospel, or the gospel sung by Mahalia. But she's still in the blues, but she does rhythm and blues. But if you think about it, Aretha is not as liberated as Patti LaBelle. Because it is a deeper exploration of human desire. And of course, the way Patti performs her music is to express a kind of liberation. And I know, for example, Purba says, when we listen to Patti LaBelle or Marvin Gaye, she says, what sounds, who else were we listening to last night?
Shalimar, I thought.
Maybe Shalimar, Howard Hewitt. Yeah, that she says it reminds her very much of church music, of the of gospel music, of not the earliest, not Mahalia Jackson gospel, but 1960s, 50s gospel music. My point is that as a consequence of the Black movement, it became acceptable, in fact, permissible, and demanded that the artists explore without boundaries, so to speak, the deep foundations of Black desire. They are singing songs they wrote or other Black people wrote, and they are singing them and the chords and all that, and Serafina knows this better than I, but they are going deep into desire, into feeling, into the celebration of desire. And you get that in Patti more than you get it in Aretha. Aretha is still very church bound. Patti, although Patti comes out of the Baptist church too, but it's almost like a different generation. Aretha's always singing the blues and the church music, like it was sung in the church. And Patti and them, once they left the church, I mean, they never leave the church, but for instance, you take LaBelle. Everybody was always asking, are they gay? Are they lesbians? You know, the way they presented themselves. I mean, it's just so interesting that they created a new normal. And you get the same thing in even Little Richard, who was, he's flamboyant and gay and everything, but still he does not go where singers like, I can't think of right now. I can think of Patty, but he doesn't go there. Luther don't go as far as Little Richard, although Luther is gay, but would not acknowledge it because he didn't want to hurt his mother's feelings, he said. You know what I'm saying? But, or you take a cat like Teddy Pendergrass. He going deeper than Motown is. In that, close the door, turn off the lights, let's make love. You don't get that in Smokey because it's not permissible in Motown. They don't want to upset the potential white normality. But it's, what I'm saying? I just say all of that to say that there is a transition from blues and early gospel, I'm talking about the 1920s, and the music, rhythm and blues music that comes out of the civil rights movement. You get like Marvin Gaye. He's going in places where Smokey Robinson won't go. You know what I'm saying? And those are choices they make. I still think like William Hart Muhammad he's still a little bit prudish compared to Teddy Pendergrass, Bobby Womack. Or we could take Ronald Isley. At some point the music gets more, quote, and I want more explicit. Can we take a shower together? That's Teddy. You understand? But you won't get that in Luther. You know what I'm saying? Luther sings songs that Dionne Warwick sang that were written by Burt Bacharach and David, I forget his name, his lyrics. But you can see that Patty is, she's, and Teddy and so on. It's that exploration of desire, which was, and what you were saying, talking too much, but you see, in Go Tell It on the Mountain, Gabriel, we need to establish a law-based community where certain things we don't do. And Baldwin says, I will, the character, Baldwin character, explore the totality of the human, of the experience. And that's where that question, it was not always permissible for Black people to express desire because we're always looking over our shoulder. Where's the white man? He gonna put us down and say we're savages if we talk about human sexuality, human freedom. But then when that civil rights movement, fuck the white man. Who are you to judge anything? Children broke down stuff. And then soul music and R&B became a judgment upon white desire as corny. That's the native Baraka. The white man is a very corny dude. Because take it. That's why you get Soul Train in American Bandstand. I'm serious. Soul Train, the Soul Train line. Bandstand, I don't know what they're doing. Because see, I hate to put it, Black people were not allowed on American Bandstand, even though it was in Philadelphia. So we had to set up our own thing. It's so deep. And our own thing became greater than their thing.
Oh, okay, wait, sorry, just really quickly. Blaze says, what a beautiful reconciliation of the importance of the individual and the collective in Du Bois, King, and Baldwin, the rich inner life of the individual, the importance of the pursuit of personal excellence and genius, but all undivorceable from and given higher meaning in our responsibility to our society, civilization, each other. That's how I understand the kind of love in his novels. Okay, Daniel Gutierrez, loving the free school today, brilliant critiques of postmodernism and identity politics. Okay, and then I'll stop there just so we have time.
Okay. All right, this is the first draft, and the more I listen to our discussion, the more I'm convinced that it has to be reworked. But I'll tell you, for everybody, this is the result of conversations that we in the organizing core of the year Baldwin have been conducting for at least a month and a half. And so this, in many discussions in preschools, and I asked if I could take a shot at writing this, and they said yes. So this is, and still a lot of work has to be done. And it's James Arthur Baldwin, God's Revolutionary Voice, in celebration of the 100th anniversary of his birth. This year is the 100th anniversary of the birth of James Arthur Baldwin. The year of James Baldwin is a celebration of the man and his literary, philosophical, cultural, artistic, and ideological contributions to the revolutionary remaking of world humanity. Oh, by the way, and this, I hate to, this relates very much to what Pulitzer is saying, because we've gone through many of the websites that are going to do a 100th anniversary, and some of the podcasts that are looking at Baldwin. So this idea of Baldwin as a revolutionary is what our take and our approach to the year of Baldwin is.
Right.
Okay. The revolutionary remaking of world humanity. Baldwin, arguably America's greatest novelist and perhaps the greatest essayist in the history of the English language, is a major figure in the intellectual history of the modern world. He spoke through the languages of the Old and New Testament and of the modern human beings, the language of modern human beings seeking meaning. He embodied the Black prophetic tradition and the existential crisis of modern people. This unique intersection produced creative ways to explain the American mind. He probed the complexities of the American mind through the lenses, and aspirations and struggles of the African American working people. The blues function as a type of poetic and moral grounding for his connections to working people. He was a man of the Black freedom movement. The movements for democracy and peace filled him with optimism. However, he sought to know and to teach as a way of changing people's consciousness and giving them intellectual tools for transforming society. Hence, in its deepest sense, his life's work contributed to the moral, spiritual, and political education of the American people. Its purpose, the revolutionary transformation of society. He believed that ideas, when embraced by the people, are perhaps the people's most powerful weapon. Baldwin was a special type of intellectual, imbued with love of people and courage to speak and act, even when his views were not always popular. James Baldwin, a revolutionary for this time. Baldwin's worldview was neither tragic nor nihilistic. It was revolutionary. He avoided what he saw as farcical reinventions of worlds that never existed, as a way to not face head-on the crisis of his time. He believed that America was possibility that could be achieved. He viewed the Black freedom movement as a revolutionary movement and Martin Luther King as a unique revolutionary. He reasoned there was both prologue and possibility in history, but people must choose the future at the end of the day. The past could not determine what will be. That would be decided by people. Revolution and prophecy defined him. He prophetically understood that the trajectories of American history could lead to catastrophe if the society were not transformed. He believed that a new democracy could arise from the people and through their achieving power. He saw whiteness as a failure of collective white consciousness, which undermined the full democratic potentiality of white Americans and all Americans. He realized that imperialist and colonialist wars, such as in Vietnam, Algeria, and Africa, were the work of anti-democratic and anti-revolutionary forces. He saw revolution as not adhering to a set of doctrines, but as a practice of people recognizing their potential and the inevitability of their struggles. As a revolutionary, Baldwin lives and breathes life into those activists and movements that will discover him. Art, literature, and the revolutionary imperative. For Baldwin, art and literature were not things in themselves as the bourgeois aesthetic might insist. They shaped the moral conditions for commitment. They were part of a revolutionary commitment. His novels, poems, and plays capture the human essence and human striving. His characters collide with the reality of racism and Black oppression. The central organizing principle of his work was freedom and its denial. His characters struggle with their identities and tragedies in the face of historical injustices. His artistic and literary imagination emerged from a special consciousness, a Black proletarian imaginary, an imaginary connected to the long struggle of Black folk for freedom, which at the same time saw the Black struggle as connected to universal struggles for freedom. This is an aesthetic anchor to the imagination of Black people flowing from their history. Baldwin was therefore inspired by artists from Bessie Smith, Donna Washington, and Aretha Franklin, Duke Ellington, Art Tatum, and John Coltrane. From the blues to gospel music to rhythm and blues to free jazz. His writing was therefore both concrete and universal. From the wide angle of humanity, he was able to better understand African Americans and Americans. Art was part of knowing the truth. For Baldwin, to know the truth is as much a question of moral striving as it is of rational and scientific thought. In this respect, art in its search for truth and as connected to freedom and striving constituted a revolutionary imperative. Art and literature's revolutionary instruments take on civilizational meaning, which is to say art and literature become part of humanity's striving to achieve new civilizations, anchored to new people and new systems of economy and politics. Literature, in Baldwin's sense, is both the present and the future and strives for the new human. And so Baldwin asks, is it possible out of the ashes and ruin of imperialism and racism, a new civilization can arise? For Baldwin, the writer, language and morality meet on the battlefield for a new civilization and a new American people. The Black Church and the Empire of Eternity. At 17, Baldwin left the church after being a preacher for 3 years. Yet the Black Church never left him. The Black Church, as he experienced it, had become too satisfied with the world as it was, rather than the world as it must become. And it too often turned its back on the Black prophetic tradition. In that tradition, Black folk were viewed as a people about whom the prophets of old spoke. That black folk were destined by prophecy to be free. The church must help people transcend the colony of time. And he thought, strive for the empire of eternity. Baldwin thought through the struggles for freedom and truth, humanity achieves immortality. The empire of eternity, as it were. So I just want to get it. That through the struggle for freedom and truth, humanity achieves immortality.
Yeah.
And as such, the empire of eternity.
Yeah.
To wage the struggle, Baldwin found the church was failing. In Martin Luther King, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, and the Black Freedom Movement, Baldwin found Black leaders who thought and acted within the Black prophetic tradition. Each in their own way saw Black folk as the people of the book, of the Bible and the Quran. For each, prophecy inspired struggles for freedom. Baldwinian love. Love was central to Baldwin's worldview. In its many forms, it reflected humans understanding what it means to be human. In his novels, especially his characters struggle for their humanity in their love for others. Sexual love was a manifestation of desire for more, for humanity in the end. Let me say it again. Sexual love was not in itself, but a manifestation of a desire for much more, for humanity. But love was the way that individuals acknowledge their oneness with other humans. The brokenness of modern capitalist societies is their undermining of love in the rush to turn human relations into commodities, serving profit and wealth and war. Love was a weapon that heals. Baldwin believed humanity had a future to the extent that the value of love would become the most universal human value. Even when exploring his own sexual identity and the multiple and varied sexual and gender identities that humans assume, he never veered from his core idea that love was the principle of human solidarity and critical to human survival and progress. Pan-Africa and Pan-Asia. Baldwin anchored his intellectual and literary work within the ideological history of the modern world. He saw the period after World War II as one where the peoples of the dark and colonized nations were on the move. He became an outspoken supporter of the anti-colonial movements and of Pan-Africanism. He argued for what was in essence the unity of Pan-Africa and Pan-Asia into a mighty anti-racist, anti-colonial force. As he said in the essay, Princes and Powers, the artist must be part of the world historic changes challenging Western modernity and its colonial and white supremacist assumptions and practice, and that he stood with humanity in the remaking of the world and its people. In this respect, Baldwin intellectually demolished the empty assumption that Western democracy was the same as freedom. He insisted that for most of the world's people, Western democracy meant slavery, colonialism, and oppression. Therefore, the path to freedom was not to imitate Western democracy, which had been appropriated by elites for whom democracy was theirs to define. Baldwin rather insisted a new democracy had to be created, a new people's democracy that considered the histories and civilizations of the Afro-Asian world. Baldwin supported, therefore, the Indian independence movement and the Chinese Revolution, the African independence movements, and the Black freedom movement as part of a single garment of destiny. To be on the right side of history meant for him to stand with the liberation of Africa and Asia and their possible unity in Pan-Africa and Pan-Asian unity. In this moment in history, this unity constitutes an Afro-Asiatic reconfiguration of the world, a recentering of humanity in a new civilizational axis. Children, youth, and humanity's future. Baldwin believed that every generation must prepare those who follow to stand up for justice. In a letter to his nephew, he insisted to make a world worthy of the young, the youth and children must fight for it. He argued that children and youth had to be treated with dignity and respect and their ideas and worldviews taken seriously. He believed that children and youth were a force for change and a force deciding the future. Youth and children were a type of warrior citizenry that must assume the vanguard in the fight for a new American people. They breathe oxygen into the lungs of society. It is upon their shoulders that civilization is renewed. Baldwin loved children and youth of every race and creed. However, he loved the children and youth in particular, who bore the burdens and legacies of oppression, whose struggle for dignity and a future required the completion of the freedom struggles started by their ancestors. He demanded that white children and youth be taught to reject white identity and white supremacy, that they see themselves through the suffering and histories of the darker races. As such, white children and youth might identify themselves with humanity whose majority is not white. The future. We are entering a new and dynamic epoch in history. Increasingly, people through their actions are deciding the moment and the future. Baldwin was neither cynic nor pessimist. He saw a path to the liberation of the American nation. This path was indeed through the Black freedom movement and the vision it gifted the American people with. He viewed whiteness as an obstacle of the American people in a dynamic struggle could throw off the shackles of whiteness and white supremacy, which pollutes the consciousness and spiritual life of the people. To achieve our nation, a new civilization, a new American man and woman must be created, he reasoned. We enter upon the year of James Baldwin to push forward his vision for a new American nation. We look upon this effort as part of the people's quest for transformative thinking and action. We, like Baldwin, and armed with his brilliant and courageous legacy, struggle to achieve our nation. We believe a new nation is possible and that a new civilization can be won. But
we apologize. We're late for our flight.
We couldn't leave the.
Y'all gonna get an Uber?
Samir's gonna take
Samir's gonna take it.
Bye.
Have a safe trip.
Miss you already.
That was great.
I'm sure if you're a Bollywood star or a Hollywood star with that Jackson.
With Seville and I will we're exchanging looks because, like my nephew is he's so right.
Yeah.
Jahan,
Oh,
Yeah.
actually, this is weird. Where'd you get this?
I just put it there.
Mary says, what a spectacular statement, Doc. We are all Baldwin's children and grandchildren. We have a responsibility to our own children. Excited to see how this all evolves. And then he says, in one of Baldwin's final interviews, he said, I have a date with the 21st century. He hoped to live to see that time, but we had already seen it. He had already seen it. He required us to be at the vanguard of this time.
Yeah. It's an easy statement. Like there's something very easy about it. meaning when I'm hearing it, I'm not feeling like it's over lengthwise or like, I think it's a good, but yeah, like, the child, that was important to me. And yeah, I do agree, just over at the final paragraph, like how to really wrap up, like what we're saying is Baldwin contributing to the future, like this new language, but like really trying to formulate it that, like you had said already in a way, like our struggle is ideological, our struggle is to achieve, in a sense, or to move forward with Baldwin. But I think I have more.
I think in this statement, what we're really trying to say is that there is a future worth fighting for. And it builds upon what we were talking about today too, which is the difference between pessimism and optimism. Because if there is a future worth fighting for, then there must be optimism. And I think the audience for the vision statement is also youth and children, but also those who care about the world that they leave behind. Because I think in where we currently stand in society, it is very, it feels like a cloud is weighing so heavy on people where there can be this sort of, oh, nothing's going to change or so on and so forth. And what we're trying to say is that things that can change and people themselves are powerful enough, and the youth and children in particular, to change the course of our country.
No, I like that though, because it helps concretize the historical context. Like when we're saying either the Afro-Asia or Pan-Asia section, like that is something real. That's not just an idea up in the air. But same thing of like the new American people, like that's not you know what I'm saying? Like the thing about a crisis that America is now going through also forces to reconcile with what Emily had just read earlier involved in the identity of the American people, and what to do also with that. We stand with King, we stand with Baldwin.
Yeah, and this idea of concretizing Baldwin for our times, which is that he is relevant for our times, whether it's within like this moral atmosphere that people face, or we talk about the poverty and violence in the city, but also not being open to seeing what is also happening in the world as well. And we've been talking about Gaza and Palestine, and we've mentioned this before too, which is that the year of Baldwin, 2024, the year of Baldwin, is dedicated to the immortal children of Gaza. I think that's what we're.
And also in a moment when people are looking for these answers, like the knowledge springs from, I forget the quote, Will Winston. Drink from wherever.
We
drink from the fountain
of knowledge wherever
it's springs. And that's like what people are looking for, young or old, but to give purpose to it, like to really strive with, like you said, to strive with the truth, with free, like those things are very important, I think. And I'm glad you said that. But like, yeah.
No, I agree so much that one of the things that we are going to try, we are going to be focusing on establishing is how much through everything that he was writing, his essays, his novels, his poems, he was basically firmly establishing the moral authority of the Black tradition. And this is the one thing that they always want to separate. They'll say things like, oh, he queered the civil rights movement, or he queered the, and, okay, fine. Just people, I guess, in being non-serious. But even in that non-seriousness, there is a serious attempt to separate him from, basically everything that's part of the Black struggle, philosophically, in terms of just action. But, this also reminds me of some interview. I think it was very close to when he actually passes away. I think it was the National Press Club speech or whatever. And it's a beautiful like thing to watch in its entirety. But I was really moved by one question when, they were taking audience question and somebody asked him, oh, when you look at Black women authors like Toni Morrison and Alice Walker, do you think your work influenced them? What do you think about the influences? Just the kind of questions people ask. And then, he basically says that, if this question is a very difficult question, because if I have to actually try and understand first he says some things about what produces a Toni Morrison and Alice Walker, what they're talking about, and how it's a testament to the role that Black women have played in society, in American society, but also in the lives of Black men. But then they say that if I have to pin down the influences, I have to go as far back as Du Bois, a figure like Du Bois, who were, among this group of people, group of very few people who were trying to reveal to the world the role played by Black men in American society, which is a role that's constantly suppressed and erased. And, every narrative that you have about the American revolutionary process, every attempt is made to remove, the contributions of Black men and revolutionaries. And it reminded me of how we talk about Baldwin as a witness, and how, I guess,
That's enough.
I mean, because he was a witness, to these, changes, these ideological struggles, these new ways in which human beings were transforming themselves, building on the values of the civil rights movement and the consciousness that it created. The fact that he was a witness is what allows us today to access some of that history and to understand the human element of all of that through his novels and essays. And yeah, I mean, it's just becoming clearer and clearer to me, because there is a way to read Baldwin very academically, or it's like a like literature critique sort of way, which doesn't really grab the essence of how momentous the things that were happening in that time was. And if you miss that, you've missed, I don't know, the starting point for when you ask questions of where we're going from here, what will democracy and freedom look for, in the new American future, you miss the starting point to be able to answer those questions if you just erase that history, that witness from that time. I don't know if that makes sense, but
Yeah, there's just something you just said there that made me also really appreciate how much I love all the different sections, the different headings, different concepts that need to be covered in a vision statement like this. And one of the ones that really stands out is just like, what kind of artist was Baldwin? How is he misremembered as an artist today? Or even like the idea that art and literature is not meant to be escapist or to. I think that's what you were getting at when you were talking about farcical inventions versus what Baldwin raced towards to be able to. And then I really liked also this idea of like the teaching and the knowing are the tools for people's liberation. And the more I feel, and the centrality of the role of ideas also in the way James Baldwin saw it. And I just think that like to emphasize that, that's something I wonder if we would want to consider for the vision statement, just the idea that today, like so many people have heard of Baldwin, but through these propped up intellectual voices, and that like I think like that Baldwin himself, he never liked being misconstrued either. He would not have appreciated, I think, the way he's understood. That's my sense at least, but just so much of the spirit that comes through in these interviews is like, stay on what I'm trying to tell you, And so I wonder if that's something also I think all of us will come to address throughout the year of Baldwin, and to read him on his terms, or to read him on the terms of what it really means to be committed or take responsibility for the American people or for the world. And whether we end up, how we end up approaching it, I think will be infused through how we approach it. But that's something I know for a fact that he disdained the way intellectuals who were not committed, you know, like because of McCarthyism or through all these different like quotes, that there is something really insidious that we also, I feel like we get that from him, but that's how I have been able to understand what the role of of intellectuals have become today, or like the universities, the elite, that sort of thing. I don't know if that makes a lot of sense, but yeah.
I really appreciate the emphasis on children. I guess I would just say that as much as we can highlight that, I was thinking a friend of mine wrote me this poem about how to deal with the blues and feeling like a lost boy in poverty, and how much I feel like I can feel that walking around my neighborhood, and how much Du Bois is able to take these notions of pain and anguish and the history of violence and turn them into these unbelievably positive things. I don't know, I love the quote that talks about saying, like, you know, all the children are artists, you know, and that we all have a responsibility. But I just, this idea you talked about before about giving children the sky, you know, giving them a sense that there still is that hope out there, that and they are the embodiment of that. And I just think, and in so many situations, kids just in my neighborhood are looking for just a blade of grass, you know what I mean? And he's a gardener, you know, he's a real, a spiritually uplifting and nourishing thing that is desperately needed for the future of our generations. Any way we can emphasize that, I would say.
Yeah, and the role and function, that's why children have to be respected, because they are contributors to civilization, and they do breathe oxygen into society. This is, I want to try to work that a little bit more. You're absolutely right, because I think, I agree very much. This Baldwin that is the property of elites and academics. Only we understand, brother. Only we know, only we, but this is why, we're going to, be doing readings of him in schools. Not enough, but this thing of children. And, I know I keep saying youth and children, but I do want to say more about children. Those, and this is Blaze's whole thing, those 7-year-olds, those 6-year-olds who are trying to find meaning, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah.
And that's what might make this kind of thing that difficult, is how do we make this as accessible to children as possible as well? Because oftentimes when we speak, in extremely complex details, which are important, we can lose that.
Yeah, but see, we gain it back if we have teachers.
Yeah.
See, this is the other thing. That's why the preschool teachers of teachers, that teaching function. Yeah, I just thought, I hear you, but that's why, the Blazers of the world, and
this
poets.
is about pedagogy,
This is
pedagogy. And
poetry is,
and this idea that, like, it is like basically for adults to know what they have to do and what their responsibility is, what their duty is, to make a world that children deserve.
This is so difficult because our audience, and this is what we're talking, our principal audience is the young generation. Although we want to reach everybody, but the young generation who have not given up. And we see it. But when we talk about the youth, oftentimes we don't talk about children. And that was hard. I hear you. I hear what you're saying, Emil. And I got to work that a little bit, because it's not just children and youth. It is that special group of children who are the most vulnerable, who are being ripped apart from the inside out intentionally, to disable them intellectually and morally from out the gate. And that's what I want to get that. I want to get that, the children. Because you're right, because we can hopefully have events for children. You know, and there's these people who are supposed to be the guardians of children to, quote, protect them from the world, is to protect them from the very thing that they need to live in the world. It's just, it's one of the great tragedies of all time, the plight of children.
But did Baldwin write children's books?
He did.
Yeah.
One?
I think it's just Little Man. Yeah. Okay, it's 2:20. And so I think we're gonna end here, but that was a great preschool, especially the beginning.
Yeah.
I think the beginning, all that you prepared, Doc, for the ideological history of modernity. Because I think that's necessary. That's necessary for to understand even the year of James Baldwin. But
I think so. Yeah.
the one thing I wanted to say is we're not going to meet next week for free school because we're planning on going to Washington DC for the National March on Washington for Palestine. And so for all of our online listeners, we will not be online. And then also for people who are based in Philly and listening, we won't be at the church. We'll be in DC. And so, but then we'll be back the week after, and we'll continue giving updates on the year of James Baldwin and also talk about what happened in DC as well. So, okay, well, thank you everyone for joining in. And it's good to see all of you. Bye.